Hey there. Tonight we're exploring the bizarre inventions of Thomas Edison you've never heard of, an electric pen that hummed through paper, a talking doll with a tiny wax cylinder, and even houses poured from concrete, not the Hollywood version, you know. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Thomas Edison did not just give the world practical light bulbs and a suspiciously tidy legend about saying he found 10,000 ways that did not work. He spent 6 decades cranking out devices that range from ahead of their time to ahead of their sanity. A screaming doll, a plan to cast entire houses like bundt cakes, an electric pen that paved the way for tattoo guns, a rumored device to chat with the dead, a star heat meter he hauled to Wyoming during a total solar eclipse in 1878. It reads like steampunk fan fiction, except it is documented in lab notebooks, patents, and the Edison papers at Rutgers. He filed 1,093 US patents between 1869 and 1933. That pace levels out to almost 1 per dozen days for an entire working lifetime. The hits still circulate in every school poster. The oddities deserve their own greatest hits album. Time to walk through the museum's weirdest wing. The first one is almost petty in the best way. In June 1869, 22-year-old Edison patented an electric vote recorder for legislatures. A slick brass and wood device connected each politician's desk to a central tally. Instant results. No roll call. No grandstanding. It solved the inefficiency that had irritated him while working as a telegraph operator and hearing trainmen grouse about political delays. He marched into the Massachusetts State House with the demo and a grin. The politicians rejected it. The whole point of a vote, they explained, was not to be fast. Delay was a feature, not a bug. The lesson landed hard. Edison later said he would never again build anything without a clear buyer already begging for it. A perfect origin story for a future mogul. Also, the first entry in the ledger of strange Edison gizmos the world did not want. He pivoted to things the public could not stop staring at. Before the phonograph swallowed the headlines in 1877, Edison cooked up one of his most misunderstood contraptions, the electric pen. Picture a sleek 19th century tattoo machine, except the tattoos are on stencils and the ink goes on paper. The device, conceived around 1875 in Newark, used a small electric motor and a rapidly bobbing needle to perforate a sheet of wax-coated paper. Ink rolled over the stencil and reproduced the original page dozens of times. A battery on the desk powered the buzzing stylus. Early adopters included business offices, churches, and a few giddy writers. Mark Twain bought one and complained in letters about the racket and the battery trouble, which says everything about Twain's love-hate relationship with gadgets. The really wild part arrives in 1891, when a New York tattoo artist named Samuel O'Reilly modified Edison's needle mechanism into the first electric tattoo machine patent, using the same motorized up and down action. Files to skin by way of stationery. Bizarre lineage, fully real, and documented in patent records and the Smithsonian's collections. Edison loved instruments that could measure the barely there. The tassimeter, cooked up in 1878, is one of those stealth inventions that sound like a Victorian parlor trick until you watch the physics. It used a tiny strip of hard rubber pressing against a carbon button. Heat makes the rubber expand. Pressure on the carbon changes its electrical resistance. A sensitive galvanometer on the circuit twitches at the slightest thermal change. Edison packed the tassimeter and hopped a Union Pacific train to Rawlins, Wyoming, for the total solar eclipse on July 29, 1878. Astronomers like Henry Draper set up refractors and spectroscopes on the prairie. Edison set the tassimeter on the corona to detect cosmic heat. The wind and shifting sky wrecked the measurement attempts, and the instrument did not give the dramatic readout he wanted. Still, the device's principle lives quietly in early thermostats and in the understanding behind carbon microphones. Bonus detail for the eclipse heads. Rawlins put up bunting and brass bands for the scientists. Edison scanned the heavens with a gadget that weighed less than a loaf of bread. The press loved the showmanship. The numbers from the corona were elusive, which is about the most Edison outcome imaginable. Fast forward a year to 1879, and Menlo Park looks like a hackerspace with coal soot. Edison and his crew built an experimental electric railway that ran over a short track just outside the lab. A locomotive pulled small cars for visiting reporters and friends, powered by electricity rather than steam. In the age of sooty locomotives, the demonstration looked like witchcraft and sounded like a bakery mixer. He never turned that demo into a commercial line, but the stunt continued a theme. He loved full-stack experiences. Make the generator, wire the rails, build the cars, run the show. Many of his oddities exist as working theatre, and the railway made that explicit. Then the device that scared school kids a century later, even though toy shelves adored it for about 5 minutes in 1890. The Edison talking doll, 22 inches tall, a cast-iron torso under a sweet dress. Inside, a tiny spring-driven phonograph with a wax cylinder recorded with nursery rhymes recited by young women employed at the factory. Turn the crank, press the chest. The doll recites, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." The performance is haunting to modern ears because the wax cylinders captured every crack, hiss, and nervous breath. Even contemporaries found the sound a little uncanny. Prices ranged around $10 to $20, painful money in 1890, equal to several hundred today. The weight made the doll awkward for actual children. The mechanism shattered if the doll was dropped. Returns flooded in. After weeks of bad headlines, production stopped. Most cylinders were destroyed, which makes the surviving examples all the more spine-tingling. In 2015, the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and the National Park Service used optical scanning to pull audio from several surviving cylinders without touching the fragile wax. The result is on the internet, and it sounds like a ghost in a tin can reciting Mother Goose. Edison aimed for wonder and built a Victorian creepypasta. The evidence lives at the Thomas Edison National Historical Park and the Smithsonian. It is not a meme, it is history. He did not stop at talking dolls. He wanted movies that talked, decades before Hollywood sorted out the technical hurdles. The first experiments emerged in the 1890s, when William Kennedy Laurie Dixon tried recording violin music into a phonograph while a short film ran on Edison's kinetoscope. The surviving snippet shows Dixon soaring a violin while 2 lab assistants dance. The synchronization between sound and picture existed only in the imagination, because the phonograph and the film camera had no physical link. Those were proofs of concept. The 1913 kinetophone system was the real gamble. A motion picture projector and a phonograph were mechanically linked by belts, so the film and the disc rotated in sync. 18 vaudeville-style shorts hit special kinetophone-equipped theaters. Speakers were horns behind the screen. Projectionists needed circus-level timing and steady power. Humidity-stretched belts. Films broke. Partner venues balked at the special rig. In 1914, a catastrophic fire tore through the Edison film studio in West Orange. The kinetophone disappeared in the smoke. Sound on film would crack the code a decade later. Edison tried to get there with ropes and pulleys. The audacity feels modern. The method belongs to a backyard workshop with a lot of clamps. Not all of his outliers look funny in hindsight. Some look grim. In 1896, X-rays erupted across the world's newspapers after Wilhelm Röntgen's announcement in Germany. Edison dove into fluorescent screens and tubes. He swapped the standard barium platinocyanide for calcium tungstate and built a fluoroscope that produced brighter images. Doctors bought them. Edison's lab assistant, Clarence Daly, became the go-to hand-holder under the beam. He suffered burns, lesions, amputations, and died in 1904 from radiation-induced cancer. That same year, Edison told a reporter he was afraid of X-rays and stopped work, an unusual retreat recorded by the New York World and retold in dozens of histories. He pulled back only after the human cost burned into him and into Daly's body. The Edison fluoroscope still sits in museums, a reminder that innovation in the 1890s had a laboratory hazard bar that would fail any modern safety audit. It also helped push the medical community toward stricter controls and better materials. Some legacies carry a wince. His biggest industrial failure doubles as one of his most cinematic. In the late 1880s and 1890s, Edison poured money into a magnetic ore separation project in northern New Jersey. The Ogden Works looked like a stone city grafted onto the mountain. Giant jaw crushers pulverized low-grade ore. Conveyor belts fed the rock to magnetic rollers that pulled out iron and left tailings to spill into artificial valleys. He raised capital, hired hundreds of workers, and promoted the plant as a solution to dwindling high-grade ore. Then the Mesabi Range in Minnesota opened up, shipping vast quantities of cheap, high-grade iron ore to eastern steel mills by 1892 and the years after. Edison fought the price collapse. Barely a decade after the first stones fell into the mall, he shut the operation down. Today, the ruin has the mood of a Roman aqueduct for geology nerds. Out of the wreckage came a pivot that spawned a fresh category of unusual Edison projects: cement. Edison took the rock grinding expertise and built the Edison Portland Cement Company in 1899. He improved kilns, experimented with new grinding media, and produced high-quality cement that flowed into bridges, factories, and stadiums. One of them looms in every sports documentary. The original Yankee Stadium, opened in 1923, used Edison Portland cement for its massive reinforced concrete stands. The company made its mark in infrastructure, while Edison chased a stranger dream: concrete houses for the masses. Not blocks, not panelized walls. He imagined a one-pour house, using a colossal set of reusable molds. The molds clamped together around a negative space house. Workers sprayed wet concrete into every cavity. After it hardened, they unclamped the molds and revealed a seamless shell with staircases, bathtubs, walls, and even kitchen cabinets already cast. No drywall, no joists, no squeaky floors. In theory, a house could be poured in a day and cured in a few. Edison estimated a price around $1,200 for a small, two-story concrete house in the 1910s, an amount that made homeownership possible for working families. The catch sat in the steel yard. The mold set required thousands of discrete pieces. Contemporary accounts put the number well over 2,000 cast iron sections, with a forest of bolts and clamps. Only a large builder could afford the upfront tooling, which Edison was ready to lease. A handful of demonstration houses went up in Union, Montclair, and West Orange, New Jersey, as well as in Gary, Indiana, and a few other towns. Many still stand, stoic and weird. Newspapers of the day published breathless sketches of concrete furniture. Edison even pitched a piano cast as part of the living room, a conversation piece that doubles as a load-bearing wall. The Smithsonian's archives and period trade journals like Cement and Engineering News document the fever dream. The idea did not scale. The molds were too expensive. The public associated concrete with sidewalks, not sofas. In a twist that would make a product manager grin through teeth, pieces of the system survive in 21st century 3D printed houses, tilt-up concrete panel construction, Kynes Parna, and precast bathtubs in apartment towers. Edison overshot the runway. The future landed a little to the side. He did not limit cement to architecture. He cast furniture, phonograph cabinets, and garden urns. He bragged about the material's fireproof virtue. He even cast storage battery casings for one of his most persistent obsessions, a better battery. The nickel-iron alkaline storage battery, patented in 1901, became the workhorse for miners' lamps, railway signals, and backup power systems. It was not as energy-dense as lead acid, but it lasted longer and shrugged off deep discharges. In the 1910s, Henry Ford and Edison toyed with an electric car using Edison batteries. Ford rolled on with gasoline. Edison kept tweaking. The device hardly qualifies as bizarre, but his belief in electric vehicles in that era reads as time traveler logic. A century later, battery electric cars are back. The chemistry's changed. The instinct feels familiar. Then comes the rumor that will not die. The spirit communication device. In 1920, business writer B.C. Forbes published an interview in the American magazine suggesting that Edison was working on a device to capture communications from the dead, leveraging the sensitivity of vacuum tubes and the permanence of the phonograph. Scientific American teased the idea the same year. Edison later walked it back, framing the talk as philosophical speculation about measuring the persistence of the tiniest life units, not a literal seance machine. His journal, later published as The Diary and Sundry Observations, includes musings about minuscule building blocks of life that might be measurable by refined apparatus. He did talk about extreme amplification and the possibility of detecting what is currently undetectable. Spiritualists latched on. Papers ran with it. There is no working spirit phone in any museum. There are interviews, notes, and publicity that glowed like radium. The myth persists because it is delicious. The facts are weirder in a quieter way. Edison wanted better instruments to measure the faintest physical phenomena. He chased sensitivity. People translated that hunger into talk of souls on the wire. The story sells itself. The archive puts asterisks everywhere. Take a breath and detour into a product that exists at the edge of novelty and broadcast history. The phonomotor, a device Edison built in the late 1870s to convert sound energy into mechanical motion. A diaphragm coupled to a lever arrangement drove small machinery when someone shouted or sang into a horn. It could spin a tiny fan or operate a very light apparatus. As a power plant, it was comically weak. As a demonstration of acoustic energy conversion, it anticipated microphones driving meters and sound pressure levels controlling machinery. It turned a parlor trick into a physics lesson. Drop it next to a modern voice-activated gadget, and the line from horn to smart speaker looks straight. His sense of show also birthed an audio niche with real social impact. The talking book. Long before audiobooks became a commute accessory, Edison pitched the phonograph as a tool for the blind. He proposed readings of literature and music lessons on cylinders. By the 1890s and early 1990s, the idea took root in libraries and schools. It is less bizarre than humane, tucked into the same catalogue that contains screen dolls and saucy electrical pens. This was a man whose lab could pivot from singing nursery rhymes to instrument-grade optics by lunch. The list of one-offs continues. In the 1880s, he improved paraffin paper for food preservation, experimented with ore briquetting, and tinkered with cement colors. He built a coin counter. He created a stencil for electric lamps to mark trademarks onto glass. None of those ever show up in school plays. All of them show up in the Edison papers and trade journals, because he was allergic to idleness and unusually generous in chasing cul-de-sacs. The best left turn of his late career sprouted in a greenhouse and a Ford motor car friendship, rubber from weeds. In 1927, with his old Florida neighbor, Henry Ford, and tire titan Harvey Firestone, Edison founded the Edison Botanic Research Corporation to find a domestic source of rubber that did not rely on imported Hevea plantations in Southeast Asia. He worked out of a lab in Fort Myers and another in West Orange. The team gathered plant specimens across the United States, Mexico, and beyond. The count reached into the thousands. The Edison papers and Florida archives frequently cite a figure around 17,000 plant samples tested. The winner was not a tree, it was a weed. Goldenrod. Edison crossbred varieties until he grew specimens that soared to 12 feet tall, with latex content reported up to about 12% by dry weight. He extracted rubber, rolled it into small bands, and sent samples to Firestone for analysis. The timing looked tragic. Synthetic rubber research accelerated. He died in October 1931. The project wound down. The photographs survive, showing Edison posing between towering goldenrod stalks like a wizard of weeds. The plant work tells a story of industrial anxiety fused with biohacking instincts that look eerily modern. As for phonographs, he never stopped iterating. Wax became celluloid. Cylinders gave way to discs. Edison marketed the diamond disc in 1912. A thick platter made of compressed wood flour and phenolic resin called condensite, played with a hard diamond stylus. The fidelity was excellent for the day. The discs were incompatible with standard shellac players, which did not help with market share. Edison promoted a network of tone tests in theaters and halls. Singers would stand beside a concealed phonograph and trade lines with their recorded selves, while the audience guessed which voice was live. People gasped when they guessed wrong. It was an audio magic trick and a marketing move, theatrical to the core. The eccentric part is the physics nerd material science, married to stagecraft. The business press loved the drama. The record-buying public drifted to other labels. He did not just make sound and light and houses. He also made mischief with the edges of communication. Around 1877, he built what can only be called a voicemail predecessor, a telephone attachment that recorded messages on tinfoil while the caller spoke. Business owners who missed a call could play back the message on a phonograph. The device did not catch on, mostly because telephone networks were primitive, but the thought landed. Decades later, similar ideas returned with magnetic tape. Edison had sketched the mentality in the age of oil lamps. It is tempting to draw a straight line through all of these projects, as if they belong on a logic tree that always converges on the light bulb. The truth looks like a bubbling stew. Edison was a brand founder, a lab manager, a copyright strategist, and a relentless recycler of scrap ideas. He ran an invention factory system that turned the creative process into an industrial process. He arranged teams and equipment so that crazy ideas could be tested fast and cheaply. The oddities prove the machinery worked. A vote recorder gets rejected, so he systematizes market checks. An electric pen fails to become a blockbuster, but its mechanism mutates into a tattoo machine and an office duplicator. The tessimeter does not measure the corona the way he hoped. but it becomes a lesson in thermal sensitivity and carbon resistance that feeds other circuits. A doll creeps out children, but the voice on the cylinder becomes a time capsule that modern labs can resurrect with imaging techniques. A single-pore concrete house does not appear on every American block, but precast construction rides on the same dream. The archive blessing of a prolific mind is the paper trail that lets everyone watch ideas sink, float, and migrate. He also built a persona. The Wizard of Menlo Park read like a superhero in the 1880s. He entertained reporters at midnight. He posed in front of a mountain of ore, a sea of cement, and a fortress of records. He feuded with business rivals over AC versus DC power. He blessed his own phonographs in theatres. He let the public in, then pivoted to secrecy when it suited him. That interplay is how a spirit phone rumor takes off. That interplay also makes people think he invented the light bulb from scratch, ignoring Joseph Swan, Sir Humphrey Davy, and dozens of filament tinkerers who came before him. Edison's talent lay in systems and endurance. He could take a bright idea, burrow through materials, scale production, set up distribution, and market it with a juggler's timing. The bizarre inventions blow away the tidy myth and replace it with something better. He was not a single-note genius. He was a factory that embraced chaos. The Edison papers are Rutgers, the Thomas Edison National Historical Park in West Orange, the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and the Library of Congress all back up this roller coaster. Primary sources show the vote recorder drawings, the electric pen motor assemblies, the tasimeter sketches, the kinetophone belt diagrams, the fluoroscope photos, the concrete house brochures, the cement invoices for stadiums, the goldenrod samples in herbarium folders. Scientific American issues across the 1870s to the 1920s chronicle his announcements and the public reactions. Trade journals add the grim details about returns and refunds on the dolls. If a story sounds too bizarre, it often sits on a stack of receipts. Now the micro-tour of oddities sharpens into individual scenes. A smoke-stained committee room. In 1869, mahogany desks, spittoons, waistcoats, and a spiddery telegraph diagram on a sheet of foolscap. Edison clicks the switch, and neat little signals appear on a central console. A clerk writes down the totals. The politicians glance at each other, swallow their annoyance, and say no. Instant voting would remove the performance. Edison learns product market fit in real time. A Newark office in 1876 hums with a battery fizz. The electric pen trembles in the hand, punching a constellation of holes. The smell of waxed paper and oil fills the room. The perforated stencil produces a dozen perfect copies with a hand roller. A young office manager smiles and then frowns at the acid on the battery terminals. In another room, a technician marvels at the steady vibration and wonders how else it could be used. 13 years later, a tattooist plugs a similar gizmo into skin and invents a subculture's primary tool. Rawlins, Wyoming, July 1878. A wind sweeps the sage. Astronomers lock down their telescopes with sandbags. Edison crouches behind a screen, peering at a small galvanometer needle hooked to the tasimeter. The sky darkens, birds settle. The sun's corona blooms like a crown behind mountain silhouettes. The needle barely twitches. It is not a failure. It is a constraint. The limit lodges in his brain like a burr. The diary and the press piece wind up with a mix of brag and sigh. Menlo Park, 1880. Children of reporters ride an electric railway as Edison grins and tells a photographer to step back. The track is short and the speed unimpressive. The novelty radiates from the fact that no coal smoke dirties the air. The public imagines a city without horses. He files away the reaction and focuses on the easier win of electrifying a square mile of lower Manhattan with power generation, a grid, and lights, which he launches in 1882. West Orange, 1890. 18 little girls and young women line up to record nursery rhymes into phonograph horns for doll cylinders. The room rattles with metal, spindles, cranks. The voices are pitchy and rushed. The wax shaves off with each playback. Salespeople box the dolls and rush them to distributors. In Ohio, a child cries when the doll's voice shifts into a warble on the fourth replay. The store accepts the return, grimacing at a corporate letter that offers refunds. The newspapers run pieces about ghoulish voices. The company shutters the toy line. A century later, engineers at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab use a camera to study the groove from above and reconstruct the audio with software, letting everyone hear the ghost again without wearing down the wax. A darkened theatre in 1913. A projectionist wipes sweat with a rag while wrestling belts and pulleys that link the projector to a phonograph through a rectangular hole in the wall. The female lead on screen tosses a string of dialogue from a megaphone-shaped horn behind the curtain. The audience leans forward. The sync drifts for a second, then snaps back as the projectionist fiddles. Reviews next morning praise the wonder and tack at the glitches. A year later, a fire destroys the studio. A decade later, the jazz singer debuts with sound on film and a seamless soundtrack that a union projectionist can run without a belt pit crew. A doctor's office, 1896. A patient in a vest places a hand under Edison's fluoroscope while calcium tungstate glows blue-green on a screen. Bones appear like magic. A dozen demonstrations like this happen every week in expos and medical halls without shielding. Daly's lab bench glows at night with radium-like excitement. The injuries accumulate. The public's appetite for marvels drives the pace. Edison hears the disquiet and finally breaks hard. Safety culture has not been invented yet. They invent it by bleeding. Northern New Jersey, 1895. The Ogden works creak and thunder with the rhythm of stone. Ore pieces rattle over magnets. Tailings pile in unnatural hills. Edison believes he is grinding his way to a steel future. Rail cars from Minnesota arrive with ore so cheap that engineers on site swear softly under their breath. The ledger glares. The work stops. The mounting keeps the scars. Edison sells off scrap and keeps the crushing lessons. New Jersey again, 1911. A field of mold pieces covers an acre. Workers bolt together panels that will form a house's negative space. Wet concrete arrives in wheelbarrows and hoses. The pour begins. The skeleton of iron disappears under the slurry. 2 days later, the molds come off. The staircase gleams like icing. The bathtub looks like a prank. Neighbors stare. Writers from Cement Age and Architectural Record take notes. A decade later, the idea mostly retires to quirky press clippings. A century later, an architecture TikTok discovers the houses still standing in Montclair and calls them brutalist cottages before brutalism existed. Fort Myers, late 1920s. Sunlight on rows of plants. Ford in a suit. Firestone in a hat. Edison in a white shirt holding a stumpy root. They laugh and lean in. Goldenrod towers behind them. Inside the lab, technicians cook, plant mash, and precipitate rubber from the brew. Newspaper reports brag about domestic rubber. Academics raise eyebrows at the yield and the economics. Edison keeps crossing plants. Numbers tick up. He writes notes on paper that already looks yellow around the edges. He dies with the project mid-plot. The lab crowded with labeled jars and presses. The sprinkles on top are smaller devices that read like footnotes but pack a punch. Edison built an early fire alarm telegraph, a chalk telegraph recorder that used electrochemical marks on paper, a mimeograph stencil innovation licensed by A. B. Dick in 1887 that exploded into office use, a home projector, and a pocket voting tally that an elections nerd would love. He made improvements to the telegraph that made stock tickers into reliable machines, the everyday machinery of capitalism. The headlines miss these devices because they are not singular or sexy. The story of a career is usually one or two icons, plus a chorus line of quiet instruments. Every so often, he would swerve into a one-liner of modernity that belongs on a hoodie. He declared that success came from 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. It is a quip found in a 1903 issue of Harper's Monthly, not a motivational poster on a high school locker. The line rings true when you walk through the oddities. The vote recorder failed not because it was uncreative, but because it misunderstood human incentives. The talking doll failed not because it was too wild, but because the materials were not ready and the voice was not charming. The kinetophone failed not because movies should not talk, but because mechanical syncing in a theatre lived in the chaos zone. The taximeter failed to measure the corona, not because the idea was dumb, but because the instrument needed a stable platform and less wind. Each weird artifact carries a tech startup lesson pinned to a piece of Victoriana. Myths follow him like static. He did not electrocute an elephant to prove alternating current was unsafe as a pry stunt against Nikola Tesla. The famous 1903 execution of Topsy at Coney Island used AC current, and Edison's name was attached by association and earlier anti-AC campaigns. But the event was organized by the park operators and a local utility. The morbid film exists because Edison's film company shot it, which keeps his name pinned to it like a bumper sticker. The myth persists because it is cinematic and grim. The record complicates the punchline. He did not invent the light bulb from nothing. Inventors including Humphrey Davy, Warren de la Rue, and Joseph Swan built electric lamps before Edison. His contribution involved the whole system and a practical filament, first carbonized bamboo, and eventually more durable materials, plus a screw socket, a dynamo, and a distribution network. The image of a solitary genius hunched over a single invention melts under the heat of the archive. He ran teams, labs, and factories. He filed patents like rainfall. He fought in court. The spirit phone myth intersects with a broader truth about him. He chased faint signals. He chased them hard enough to make people believe he could trap the human soul. That is a credit and a caution. The 19th century loved a good séance. The early 20th loved a good amplifier. Edison sat at the intersection with a press office. He leveraged that attention to sell records and cement and batteries, and to fund experiments in eclipse heat and botanical rubber. The result looks like a trunk full of props from a traveling show and a library full of notebooks that amount to a catalogue of obsession. The strangest part of Edison's career is not any single invention. The strangest part is the business model. He built an engine for prototyping reality. If a weird idea crossed his desk, he could point at a bench with a lathe, a shelf of chemicals, and two assistants who knew how to rig a vacuum pump. In a week, the idea would either make a sound or not. Investors would either lean forward or not. A dozen of these cycles could run in parallel. A manager could walk from a phonograph chamber to a cement test kiln to a goldenrod press in a single afternoon and leave notes at each. The factory did not care if the output was a calculus of celestial heat or a nursery rhyme doll. It cared that something clickable emerged from the other side of the door. The legacy of the bizarre inventions is more than novelty. They illustrate the cost of invention in bodies and cash. Clarence Daly's death is an obituary that belongs in every retelling of Edison's career. The Ogden ore works represent millions of dollars of sunk cost and thousands of hours of human labor, ending with a market shift he could not control. The concrete houses hold dreams of affordable shelter that remain alive in each housing crisis headline. The electric pen hums in the lineage of every buzzing needle in every tattoo shop. The kinetophone laughs from the balcony as credits roll on Dolby Atmos, and the belt pit stays empty. The spirit phone exists only in clippings and speculative smiles, which may be the best place for it. Primary sources stitch the weirdness to the main narrative. The Edison Papers project at Rutgers has digitized notebooks and correspondence that showed drafts, sketches, and procurement lists. The Thomas Edison National Historical Park preserves labs in West Orange with equipment on benches, jars labeled with spidery writing, and machines that look like they might wake up if someone plugs them in. The Smithsonian carries components of the electric pen, doll mechanisms, and audio gear. The Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory's Irene technology for scanning damaged records documented the talking dolls' voices in 2015, turning grooves into data without touching them. American Magazine and Scientific American carried the Spirit device, Hype, in late 1920, showing how media can inflame or distort an inventor's musings. Trade journals from 1908 to 1915 described the concrete house molds with numbers that make engineers flinch. Edison the brand has a shadow that belongs to messier and funnier stories. He fillets the myth of the bolt of inspiration by showing up every day and banding together things that sometimes look ridiculous. He builds a business out of turning laboratory debris into product lines. He forces the public to stare at an uncanny doll and decides novelty without durability is a trap. He rises early enough to watch railcars carry away the anecdote that will kill his ore business and pivots into cement with a stubbornness that later poured the stands of the house that Ruth built. The list of offbeat Edison projects can keep going until it looks like he invented every weird Victorian gadget in a trunk. A little restraint serves the truth. Emphasize the parts that leave fingerprints. The vote recorder sketched a lesson in politics. The electric pen birthed duplicators and tattoo machines. The tassimeter caught the scientific spirit of chasing the barely perceptible. The fluoroscope warned inventors not to put the lab before human life. The kinetophone illustrated the difference between audacity and shipping. The concrete houses showed how a manufacturing mind sees a city block as a set of molds and a schedule. The goldenrod rubber hunt showed that a famous inventor could pivot to plant breeding out of industrial necessity and nationalist anxiety. The spirit machine rumor showed the volatility between science and spectacle. Put those together, and you get a human being who was more interesting than the bland cartoon of a man holding a light bulb. Modern humor sneaks in because the scenes practically write the jokes. Imagine explaining to a kid in 1890 that the world needs a doll that wheezes Mother Goose. Imagine being the projectionist in 1913 and telling the manager the belt stretched because the theater was too humid. Imagine trying to convince a builder that casting a piano in concrete is a good idea, and then watching him calculate how many nephews it will take to carry the mold. The wry comments write themselves because the ambition and absurdity share a wall. A lot of modern tech feels like that too. The line from Edison's oddities to a phone pinging for a software update is not that long. He was flawed, brilliant, relentless, and occasionally reckless. He built contraptions that should have stayed in notebooks and contraptions that walked into people's homes and changed dinner lighting forever. The bizarre inventions do not just pad out the back half of a museum tour. They are the best windows into his brain. They show what he thought could be bent into commercial shape. They show his appetite for public show and his willingness to run into walls. They show how easily a rumor mutates into a legend and how easily a failure mutates into the seed of someone else's success. The next time the phrase Edison bulb hangs over a cafe table, picture a stable of lab assistants in 1890 recording nursery rhymes into a horn for a doll that would be returned within the month. Picture a weed taller than a man oozing latex in Florida sun, while Ford and Firestone debate yield per acre, and Edison squints at a test tube. Picture an engineer tightening a belt in a suffocating booth behind a screen, while an audience leans forward as if a miracle might hold for one more minute. Picture an eclipse in 1878, a prairie wind and a needle that almost moves. Picture a mold yard that could swallow a neighborhood and spit out a house. The pleasing myth shrinks Edison to a symbol. The bizarre inventions expand him back into a restless man in a workshop, surrounded by belts, dust, glass, carbon, wax, weeds, and the occasional concrete piano sketch. That is the better story. It comes with receipts. It comes with numbers. It comes with a screaming doll that still haunts the internet and a stadium built out of powdered rock that felt like forever. It comes with a lesson that the best side quests in history are not detours. They are maps of the tech frontier drawn, erased, and redrawn by people willing to look foolish until they do not. Moving on, our next tale is titled The Development of the Hanseatic League, Trade and Influence. A medieval shipping cartel once told kings where to sit, rerouted Europe's economy with barrels of fish, and made a language sound like rolling barrels and wet rope. It did not have a flag or a capital. It had a letterhead, a lot of seals, and a habit of sending embargoes that hit like a battering ram. Merchants called it the Hans, rulers called it a problem, and historians call it the Hanseatic League. The scene lands in the north, where wind tastes like salt and pine, and everything smells faintly of tar. On the Trave River, around 1159, a town called Lübeck is reborn under a duke with ambitions larger than his title. He wants a doorway to the Baltic, and Lübeck is it. Cogs, broad-bellied, single-masted ships with blunt noses and stubborn patience, creak against the quays as men in thick wool haul sacks of something that looks like dirt and smells like money. That dirt is salt from Lüneburg, essential for preserving the fish that keeps half of Europe fed on Fridays. The Hansa did not start as a league. It began as an idea engraved in timber and habit. Merchants moving in packs for safety, pooling information the way sailors share rumors about shoals. The word Hanse shows up in the 12th century to mean a traveling band of merchants. Before anyone talks about a league of cities, English kings are already dealing with a group called the German Hands in London. In 1157, Henry II confirms special privileges for Cologne merchants. In 1260, Henry III confirms rights for the merchants of the empire. And a few decades later, there is a clear, bustling German enclave by the Thames called the Steelyard, or Stahlhof. From the start, the brand is strong. Cheaper freight, reliable grain, bolts of cloth delivered on time, stomped with wax seals like medieval five-star reviews. A blunt truth takes shape. Northern Europe is a giant conveyor belt. Grain, timber, wax, furs, rye, and iron flow out of the Baltic and Russia. Wool, cloth, finished luxuries, and metals flow in from England, Flanders, and the Rhineland. The hinge connecting the conveyor belts is a network of ports and privileges, and Lübeck is the hinge's hinge. Frederick II makes it official in 1226, granting Lübeck imperial immediacy and the right to act like a city that answers to the emperor and no one in between. That charter sets the tone. Lübeck is not just a town. It is a coordinator. Myth check lands early. There is a famous 1189 charter for Hamburg, allegedly granted by Emperor Frederick I promising toll freedom on the Elbe. Anyone who has ever watched medieval politics knows a suspicious seal when they see one. Modern scholarship calls that charter a 13th century forgery. Hamburg's trade clout did not come from a single miraculous parchment. It came from location, smarts, and alliances. For one thing, Hamburg and Lübeck sign a pact around 1241 to secure the overland route between the Elbe and the Baltic, making sure wagons and sailors are not extorted into poverty along the way. From that deal onward, people who threaten Hanse traffic keep falling down stairs they did not even see. The ships keep changing the odds. The stern-post rudder, adopted in the 12th and 13th centuries, lets big boxy cogs handle heavy seas and shallow ports. A typical cog carries around 100 to 200 tons of cargo in the 14th century, and some monsters push toward 300 tons. Not sleek, not glamorous, more floating warehouse than seafaring knife, but perfect for bulk. Above deck, crews build wooden castle-like structures fore and aft to fend off thieves and to lord it over lesser hulls at quayside. Tar and oakum keep the planks honest. The Baltic answers with storm and chop. The cogs answer with endurance. Now the map lights up. Gotland, a fat stone in the middle of the Baltic, hosts Visby, a port so rich that the town walls look like a costume drama trying too hard. German merchants have been on Gotland since the 12th century, signing agreements with locals, shouting over exchange rates, and periodically reminding themselves not to cross the wrong night. In 1280s documents, German traders on Gotland are negotiating rules for the Novgorod run, plus privileges in Sweden. Visby's heyday culminates in commercial law compilations that later echo through the so-called laws of Wisby, maritime rules that become best practice doctrine across the north. Meanwhile, farther east, Novgorod looms. Wax, furs, and hides move out through the great trade artery of the Volkhov and the Neva. German merchants settle in a trading compound called the Peterhof. Not a palace, a fortified courtyard with warehouses and a church of Saint Peter. The Novgorod Skra, the statute book for the German merchants there, lays down rules with cold precision. No carrying weapons in markets, no staying overnight among locals, no learning too much Russian, no marrying locals. It reads like the bylaws of a gated community with nerves of steel. In exchange, privileges pop into focus, low tariffs, stable rights, protection by the city's Posadnik, and wax candles as thick as arms head west to light churches from Lübeck to London. Northwest, London's steelyard hums with traffic. The German merchants are not beloved by locals. They are too efficient, too organized, and they get tax breaks nobody else gets. Yet kings need grain and timber, and the Hanse delivers. Bruges and Ghent beckon in Flanders as well. By the late 13th century, German merchants are regulars at Bruges, with a contour, a regulated enclave with its own aldermen and rules. Bruges sits near the mouth of the Zwin Channel, a watery thread linking it to the North Sea, and for a century it is the nerve centre where Italians meet Flemings, Flemings meet English, and everyone meets the Hanse. South of Sweden, the herring go biblical. In the 13th century, herring arrive in fat shoals at Scania, particularly around Skanör and Falsterbo, right where the Baltic squeezes toward the Øresund. From August to October, the water fills with silver. Thousands of barrels get salted and shipped. Kings count tolls. Merchants count profits. The Scania fairs become Europe's fish heart, and Hanseatic ships, especially from Lübeck and Wismar, dominate the process. Salt from Lüneburg meets herring at Scania. The result is winter survival for a huge swath of Europe. North again, In Bergen, the German wharf called Briggen grows into a full-blown contour. It is timber, tar, and order. Long wooden warehouses lining the Bergen harbour, each with a loft, a counting house, and bunks for young clerks who learn Low German numeracy by the smell of cod. Stockfish, hard, dry, unsalted cod dried on racks by Arctic wind, leaves the north and flows into the kitchens of Lübeck, Cologne and Bruges. Bergen's contour gets formalized around the 14th century and lasts, unbelievably, until 1754. These German warehouses survive fires, taxes, kings, and cultural whiplash. And they still stand today in candy-coloured lines that tourists photograph, while not quite grasping the power those planks once represented. Through it all, the language of the deal is Middle Low German, the working tongue of the North Sea and Baltic. Shipmates shout in it, ledger entries note accounts in it. Danish and Swedish chancelleries pick up Low German vocabulary by osmosis, because trade clerks keep writing privileges and treaties in it. The currency of account often tumbles down as the Lübeck mark. Lübeck marks with 16 shillings per mark in some reckonings, smoothing out exchange haggling. Cities copy Lübeck's municipal code too. Lübeck law spreads east like a firmware update. Tallinn adopts it in 1248, and dozens more follow. Cities from Rostock to Riga run their councils, weight and courts with rules stamped, as in Lübeck. That is the infrastructure. Here comes the logic. The Hanse is a network of cities and their merchant elites, not a sovereign state. There is no formal membership list, carved in oak. It is a living thing defined by participation and mutual action. It has entrenched privileges in foreign markets. It has reciprocal protection pacts. It has diets, general meetings called Hanseatic, where delegates bicker in Lübeck's town hall or other host cities over dues, piracy, and whether someone in Cologne is being too Cologne. The first formal General Assembly with preserved minutes occurs in 1356 in Lübeck. That date matters because it shows a new gear clicking into place. The Hanse speaking with something like a single voice, at least when it had to. Then the economy tips toward opportunity and risk. The 14th century brings the Black Death. In 1347, 1351, people die in terrifying numbers. Cities shrink, but a counterintuitive effect appears. Labor is scarce. Wages rise. Survivors eat better. Demand for bulk goods remains, and the Hanse sits precisely where the bulk goods move. Grain from Prussia and Livonia, copper and iron. From Sweden's Bergslagen, tar and timber from the vast northern forests, amber from Prussia's sands, wax and furs from Novgorod. These are not luxury goods. These are economy-sustaining inputs, and the Hanse is the connector. It is also a bully when needed. Denmark's kings control the straits. That matters because ships moving from Baltic to North Sea pass under their nose. In the early 14th century, Valdemar of Atterdag starts rebuilding Danish power. He reclaims lands, asserts rights, and generally behaves like a king who expects deference from merchants. The Hanse responds, like a cartel with teeth. In 1367, a coalition called the Cologne Confederation forms under Lübeck's leadership, pulling in around 50-60 towns, by various counts, from Cologne and Dortmund in the west to Riga in the east. The target is Denmark. The trigger is the grinding down of Scania privileges and harassment of ships. The war is fought with blockades and fleets paid for by merchant taxes. In 1370, the Treaty of Stralsund forces a Danish climb down so dramatic that later writers portray the Hanse as having a veto over the Danish throne. The actual text grants the Hanse control over key castles in the Øresund for 15 years, restores and expands trade rights, and cements the League as the Baltic's enforcer. Formal veto is fuzzy in the parchment, but practical influence is not. Any future Danish king will think about Lübeck before raising tolls. There is a reason kings tolerate all this. When the Hanse imposes a blockade, prices spike. Urban populations feel it first. Flanders wants timber for ship masts and ashes for dyeing. England needs pitch and tar, and it needs grain when harvests fail. Novgorod wants silver, cloth and salt. Chroniclers note shortages that end once privileges are restored. The Hanse takes no victory lap. It simply sends ships. Behind those ships sits structure. By the 14th century, the League is divided into quarters. Regional groupings such as the Wendish quarter centered on Lübeck and the Pomeranian coast, the Westphalian quarter more inland, and to the west, the Saxon quarter and the Prussian Livonian quarter to the east. Each quarter has its own network of towns that argue with neighbours, but still move together when the League calls the Diet. Lübeck, by custom and heft, hosts the Chancellery and keeps records, like an unenthusiastic but effective student who always has the group project binder. A city like Cologne is not coastal, but it is vital. It has the staple right, a medieval device that forces shippers passing through to unload, sell, or at least offer goods to local buyers. Staple rights sound parasitic. In practice, they create markets and standardize measures. Cologne's baths, wine taverns, and cloth halls make sure passing merchants leave coins behind, along with shiprats. Another piece hums in the background. Agents run these trades. A Lübeck merchant does not always sail to Novgorod. He often employs factors working in contours. Those factors draft letters in neat, low German, using formulae that would look breezily familiar to a modern corporate lawyer. The contour in Bruges has aldermen, an elected board, and a court that hears disputes among members. Members pay dues. They obey strict statutes, recorded in copies like 1347's Bruges Ordinances. The Steelyard in London gets chapel privileges and its own dock cranes. That legal muscle matters because it lets the Hanse present a unified legal front abroad, even though back home the cities would cheerfully sue each other over lead weights. Crises keep the League nimble. Pirates slice across the narrative, like a band break during a festival set. In the 1390s, the Victual Brothers, Victualienbrüder, work as privateers and then freebooters, feeding besieged Stockholm and then turning to general mayhem. Klaus Störtebeker becomes the poster child for outlaw romance. He is captured in 1401 by a Hamburg-Lübeck fleet off Heligoland under Simon of Utrecht and executed in Hamburg, along with more than 70 of his crew, depending on the chronicle. The famous story says his decapitated body walked past a line of his men to spare them before collapsing at the 11th, 12th, or 14th step. The actual record is quieter. The city exercised its rights, and the Hanse cleaned up the sea lanes. Heads rolled. Yes, heads did not walk. Even as the League swats pirates and browbeats kings, new competitors master the trick of moving bulk faster and cheaper. Dutch shippers experiment with hull design and remarkable efficiency by the late 15th century. The Great Herring Shift nudges Danish profits. Shoals concentrate in the North Sea rather than the Øresund. Dutch fishers perfect large-scale curing at sea, sometimes credited to techniques associated with Willem Bockel's own in the 14th century, and field big herring buses that can stay on station for weeks. That makes the Scania markets less indispensable. It also lets the Dutch sell fish, salted and sound into the Hanse's own cities. On the eastern shore, another tectonic plate moves. The Teutonic Order, which had carved a crusader state across Prussia and the Baltic coastline in the 13th century, begins to fracture under civil and military strain. Prussian cities, Gonsk, Elblanc, Toruń, form the Prussian Confederation in 1440, ally with King Casimir Pav of Poland, and trigger the 13 Years' War, 1454 to 1466. When the Second Peace of Thorn hits in 1466, Royal Prussia goes to the Polish crown with wide municipal autonomy. The old order's centralized muscle recedes. Gdansk grows into a heavyweight run by its own council. Grain from the Vistula Basin flows through Gdańsk out to the Netherlands on massive scale in the 16th century, as much as hundreds of thousands of tons per decade, much of it no longer under Lübeck's guiding hand. The route remains Hanseatic in spirit, but less in control. England trades blows with the League in the second half of the 15th century. English merchants want to wring the Steelyard dry, or at least squeeze it harder. Tensions boil into the Anglo-Hanseatic War of 1469-1474. Piracy, privateering and seizures escalate. The result is the Treaty of Utrecht in 1474. It is a Hanseatic win. The League recovers impressive privileges in England, including restitution for losses and recognition of the Steelyard's property. The League wins that won on paper and in practice, yet the victory rings with an echo of inevitability. England will keep pushing, and the Steelyard will live on only to be closed in 1598 by Elizabeth I after repeated political spats. It is the kind of closure that makes obvious sense only decades later when the balance of sea power has changed. In Denmark, King Eric of Pomerania kicks off the Sound Dues in 1429, a neat toll on ships passing the Øresund between Elsinore and Helsingborg. It is daylight robbery with perfect paperwork. Over the next 2 centuries, the Sound Dues feed the Danish crown like a subscription service that nobody can cancel. The Hanse bargains, complains, then pays. War with Denmark has already had one act. The First Hanseatic War with Denmark in 1426-1435 ends with the Peace of Vordingborg in 1435, confirming privileges while keeping tension smouldering. Another round in 1510-1512 concludes with the Treaty of Malmö. The League still has ships. It still has negotiators. The expense is growing, and so is the discomfort with being everyone's favorite toll payer. This is not a state, as legal historians like Philippe Dollinger emphasized when he wrote the foundational synthesis, the German Hanse, in 1964. There is no army on a payroll, no national tax, no sovereign veto over cities. There is, however, what looks suspiciously like a syndicate with excellent clerks. In 1556, the League hires a permanent legal counsel, a syndic named Heinrich Sudermann, to professionalize negotiation and record-keeping. Letters under his hand move to kings and councils. Dockets stack up in Lübeck. Even as the League's apex has passed, its paperwork becomes clinical and precise. It negotiates with London over seized cargoes, with Denmark over dues, with Swedish miners over copper shipments. It is a corporation of cities that realized late that it needed an in-house lawyer. Supporters of the League's myth love the number 200. It sounds like an empire. Actual attendance at diets fluctuates. Roughly 70 to 90 cities take part regularly in the 14th and 15th centuries, depending on the issue. Many more maintain loose affiliation and enjoy privileges that the core fights to protect. Membership is situational. Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, and a ring of coastal and inland towns form the spine. Cologne anchors the west. Gonsk and Riga are the east. Rostock, Wismar, Stralsund, Greifswald, Stettin, and Danzig wear the brick faces of brick Gothic like a team uniform. The architecture advertises confidence. Lübeck's Holstentor goes up between 1464 and 1478. A fairy tale gate with round towers and a motto that roughly translates to harmony within, peace without. Oddly accurate for a town that weaponizes diplomacy. Rows of gabled warehouses rise along the Trave. The Salzspiker storing salt that keeps the fish business moving. Across the sea, brigands' guild houses lying Bergen's harbour in red, yellow, and brown. Inside those timbered walls, strict hierarchies dictate which apprentice gets to carry, which ledger, and how he learns to convert marks Lübisch into pounds sterling without crying. Trade goods paint the map in gritty, specific colour. Grain is measured in lasts and bushels, and Gigantsk's last is not Lübeck's. Tar, resin, and pitch are rolled up in barrels that leak into the floorboards. Swedish iron bars arrive, marked with mine stamps from Bergslagen, including Falun, whose copper output between the 14th and 17th centuries supplies so much of Europe's metalwork that it creates copper roofs and bronze bells. Far away, Prussian amber gets carved into jewelry in Königsberg and Donsk and shipped west as a fashion flex. Flemish cloth moves in bolts dyed with woad and madder, smelling faintly of urine, because 15th century finishing is not for delicate noses. Beer, especially from towns like Lübeck and Danzig, travels in casks labelled with house marks, simple glies that function like logos, declaring that brand is back to normal after the last batch exploded. The League's law and order side holds itself together with hard-nosed detail. The Hanseatic, the published acts of the Hanseatic, record votes on when to dispatch emissaries to Novgorod, to soothe the dispute, or when to close the Bruges contour temporarily to enforce demands for debt repayment. Bruges loses favour periodically when the city council meddles too much with contracts, so the merchants temporarily shift operations to Antwerp in the late 15th century. Antwerp's deeper Scheldt Channel and rising financial markets in the 1500s offer an irresistible mix: more bankers, more risk capital, and a sense that trade is migrating west to the Atlantic. Bruges silted up like an aging artery. Antwerp takes over flashing lights like a new port of the future. And later, Amsterdam out-Antwerps everyone. That westward shift feeds the League's decline. A North Atlantic economy roars to life with Portuguese spices and silver from the Americas. The Dutch and the English master distant convoys and joint stock companies. The League still hauls bulk, grain and timber. It cannot pivot into spices or global cargo without fundamentally altering its structure. And the structure resists. Cities like Hamburg adapt individually. Hamburg becomes a major Atlantic trading city in the 17th century. The League as a collective becomes a part-time parliament for cities that increasingly prefer to freelance. The eastern flank flickers hard. Ivan III of Moscow decides in 1494 that the Han's privileges in Novgorod are not worth the political friction. The Peterhof is seized. German merchants pack up their wax candles and charters and leave. That matters because access to Russian furs and wax slides into Russian hands and other channels. The League can still get wax through Riga or Narva, but it is a longer fight. One of the 4 major contours goes dark. The Bruges contour will lose primacy as Antwerp ascends. The Steelyard's privileges will be chipped away and then axed in 1598. Bergen persists because Norwegians like the steady supply of grain and the Germans like the steady supply of fish. and the Danish-Norwegian crown likes the steady supply of taxes. For anyone tempted to write the League off as medieval only, the Bergen contour's longevity is a jolt. It lasts until the 18th century, closing in 1754 after reforms. That is a time span that outlives dynasties. It also underlines a theme. The Hans built institutions that stuck. The League fades as a collective. The habits it created, contour governance, alderman statutes, audit requirements, standardized measures, roll into the DNA of North European trade. Back in the 16th century, formal structure wanes. The longest-lived organs are the Diet and the Chancellery registers. The last General Diet meets in 1669 in Lübeck, attended by a handful of cities that can still be bothered to send representatives and pay for wine. Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen remain the core survivors, parlaying Hanseatic pedigrees into legal autonomy, well into the modern era. Even today, official names read like an archival echo. Free and Hanseatic city of Lübeck, Free and Hanseatic city of Bremen. The brand refuses to die because it is anchored in centuries of contracts and court decisions. A pause helps to debunk what the Hans was not. It was not a territorial state. It did not have a monopoly on violence. It did not even have a stable membership list. A city could be in for some issues and out for others. It was not ethnically pure either. Many cities were German-speaking, yes, speaking Middle-Low German, Low Saxon flavors of trade talk, but the network included Dutch towns for significant stretches and local elites in Scandinavia, Poland, and the Baltic mostly spoke and dealt in the lingua franca without surrendering their identity. English merchants collaborated when it made sense and boycotted when it did not. Even women, though largely cut out of formal merchant guilds, appear in city records as widows managing warehouses, tavern keepers handling accounts, and ship owners in their own right, in a few notable cases such as evidence from Danzig and Lübeck in the 15th century. They did not run the contours. They did run businesses that kept the supply chain intact. There is old-school glamour in the violence, of course. Sieges and sea battles do not leave the League entirely. During the 1510-1512 war with Denmark, Lübeck sends fleets into the Øresund and the Kattegat. Stralsund and Danzig outfit ships. Captains carry letters of marque that legalize privateer action. The campaigns are costly. Peace brings confirmed privileges again, plus relief that the League avoided a long, draining conflict. The emotional high of 1370, when Stralsund shoved Denmark into a corner, never fully returns. War in the 16th century proves nobody can afford to be king of the Baltic for long. Inside the cities, the Reformation redraws lines. Lübeck, Hamburg, and many others adopt Lutheranism in the 1520s. Confessional politics intrude on trade alliances. A Lutheran city can still buy fish from Catholic Bergen, but the councils now worry about church property, new forms of poor relief, and whether to fund schools that teach catechism in German rather than Latin. The money that once financed wars against Denmark stretches now to pay for pastors and printers. The League's cohesion, already a hard-won compromise, gets shakier as cities find that their domestic agendas diverge. Outside, empires rumble. Sweden becomes a Baltic great power in the 17th century under kings like Gustavus Adolphus, seizing ports and mines that once fed Hanse ships. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth asserts rights over Royal Prussia. Denmark-Norway plays traffic cop with the Sound dues until the 19th century. The 30 Years' War tears across Germany from 1618 to 1648, shredding trade and depopulating regions that once sent carts to Hanse markets. Lübeck and Hamburg try to stand aside as neutral traders. Neutrality pays less when the roads are impassable, and the countryside has the economy of a graveyard. Yet the Hans fingerprints are everywhere. Commercial law codifications in German cities borrow heavily from the statutes of Hanse contors and guilds. Insurance practices, bottomry loans, where ship owners borrow against hull and cargo, show up in the League's letters and then spread. Arbitration becomes a habit, because hauling a merchant to court in a foreign city is slower than getting 3 aldermen to decide by lunch. Middle Low German contributes business vocabulary to Scandinavian languages, and the style of city council minutes created an administrative tradition that modern municipalities still mirror. The League was essentially a medieval compliance department that ran on wax seals and civic pride. Numbers anchored the story in solid ground. Around 1200, Lübeck has perhaps 8,000 inhabitants. By 1400, it pushes toward 20,000, making it one of the largest cities in northern Europe. Gdansk grows to around 40,000 by the late 16th century, thanks to grain exports. Cologne sits huge for its area, with numbers in the 30,000 to 14,000 range in the 14th century. These are not megacities by Mediterranean standards, but in the north they matter. A single cog carrying 150 tons of rye can feed a small city through a bad season. Hundreds of such loads per year flip the switch on regional food security. Kings can talk magniloquently about divine right, but a merchant with a 200 ton cog and a letter of wares can quietly decide which urban population sleeps easy. The journey back to the 13th century pivot point reveals how specific this network was. The Battle of Bornhoved in 1227 ends the Danish king Valdemar II's expansion into northern Germany. A coalition of princes and cities. Think of it as a medieval version of everyone who is mad at the same person at once. Defeats Danish forces. That matters for Lübeck, because it removes Danish overlordship and clears the road for the 1226 privilege by Frederick VI to be more than parchment. From then on, Lübeck acts like a city that belongs to the emperor, not to any local duke or foreign king. City autonomy is a weapon in the Hans toolkit. When Lübeck speaks in the Diet to remind Danzig not to back a wayward duke, or to urge Stralsund to expel pirates, it speaks in the voice of a free imperial city, not a vassal. City charters multiply like passwords to exclusive clubs. Tallinn, then called Revel, gets Lübeck law in 1248. Riga adopts a related Germanic legal framework earlier in the 13th century. Gdansk shifts between overlords, but holds on to Germanic city, law, and institutions that help its council stare down would-be masters. This legal uniformity made trade frictionless. A Lübeck merchant could walk into a court in Riga and understand a suit about a missing barrel of pitch because the court's procedure mirrored his own, down to the number of oath helpers required to assert a claim. When Bruges founders on Sylt, Antwerp surges. In the 1520s and 1530s, Antwerp is Europe's clearinghouse for silver and pepper. Hansa merchants set up shop in the city with new energy, yet something is off. They are not building the rules anymore. They are players in someone else's game. The Antwerp Bourse sets the tempo. Joint stock ventures and bills of exchange are more complex than the contours aldermen are comfortable with. Lübeck's council minutes are still rich in details about ship movements, but Antwerp moves faster. The League's best strategy becomes strategic conservatism. Dominate regional bulk where it can. Avoid the new games where it cannot. The legal environment in England shifts too. In the 15th century, Parliament passes statutes favouring its native merchant adventurers. The Intercursus Magnus in 1496 resets relations between England and Burgundy, shaping cloth trade through Antwerp rather than through Hanse intermediaries. The 1474 Treaty of Utrecht gives the Hans a reprieve, but repeated seizures and feuds erode that hold. The closure of the Steelyard in 1598 is not a surprise. It is the end of a slow squeeze when national policy turns protectionist, and the Hanse's adaptive capacity is limited by its very structure. Cities voting collectively with slow, deliberate minutes while a national crown can decide in a day. The ships themselves change under pressure. The 16th century North Sea sees larger ocean-going types, carracks and galleons, while the Baltic continues to love its hulks and cogs, and then adopts improved forms of the hulk. Dutch fleets, square-rigged with capacious bellies and narrow decks that gain tax regimes based on deck area, appear in the late 16th century. Their efficiency crushes freight rates. Dutch skippers undercut Hanse rates all over the Baltic by the early 17th century, with habit and hard work, not with any single invention. Freight rates are economics' way of saying whose time it is. In the 13th and 14th centuries, it is the Hans' time. In the 17th century, it is the Dutch. Not all is loss. Local networks survive. Hamburg and Bremen reinvent as gateways of Atlantic trade in the 17th and 18th centuries. Lübeck becomes a regional port feeding Scandinavia and Russia. Baltic timber and tar flow into the shipyards of Europe for centuries, and many of those contracts still rely on the old networks. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Lübeck marks get replaced by thalers, and then by marks again, under different empires. Bureaucracy modernizes. The spirit remains. Civic elites still think like merchants, not landlords. The Hanse's ideology lurks under the surface and remains useful. It is civic independence with a purpose. It is the idea that a city is a republic of trade. Magistrates answer to guilds and councils, not castles. City-led coalitions can move faster than kingdoms on some fronts. The League's embargoes are economic warfare in an age before formal naval blockades get codified. The Cologne Confederation's war chest and fleet lists look like spreadsheets for conflict. A ship bought in Wismar appears next year on a roster in Stralsund, repost for convoy escort. The League pivoted constantly between private profit and common action, hydra-headed and weirdly effective. Artifacts of that weirdness mostly remain above water. Visby's town wall still stares down the sea. Lübeck's skyline glows with brick Gothic gables that keep better time than a calendar. Briggen, in Bergen, stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, all timber angles and tight alleys, and still smells faintly of cod to anyone with an imaginative nose. London's Steelyard is gone, paved over by new dreams, though a plaque nods at the spot. Antwerp's old bourse echoes with emptiness that only a financial historian can fully love. In Gdansk, the medieval crane called the Zura still squats by the Motwelloa River, like a mechanical dinosaur. The paper trail is deep, and historians dive into it with glee. Acts of the Hanseatic are published in multiple volumes. Carsten Jarnke and others mapped the convoy systems. Johannes Schildhauer's studies of Baltic trade describe ship technology and cargo minutiae with the enthusiasm of a man who has smelled too much tar and is fine with it. Jürgen Brecker's curatorial work at the Museum for Hamburgische Geschichte turned Störtebeker from an urban legend into a case study in urban myth-making. All of it converges on a set of bright truths. The League formed over a long century from alliances between cities like Lübeck and Hamburg, dynamic legal adoption like Lübeck law, commercial privileges in key foreign ports. and a ship technology suited to its waters. It peaked in confidence with the Treaty of Stralsund in 1370 and the First General Diet in 1356. It preserved and expanded privileges in the 15th century with war and negotiation, then bled influence in the 16th century as trade patterns shifted west and national states tightened control. A few crisp scenes lock the narrative into place. A convoy of hulks leaves Danzig in the 1490s, barrel staves creaking, bound for the Low Countries, with grain that will calm bread riots in Haarlem. An alderman in Bruges slams a seal down on a scrap, demonstrating that no Hans merchant may buy dyed cloth outside the approved streets. Even the herds officials in Novgorod throw German bales through a Peterhof gate, like they are clearing a storage unit nobody is paying for. Lübeck's town hall hosts a diet, where the room is so full of fur-trimmed councillors that the scribe writes notes in margins, because he cannot spread out. Elizabethan officers tack a closure notice on the Steelyard's door in 1598, and the river carries away the grumbling of merchants who once thought their privileges eternal. The League's satellite view is now simple. It was Europe's most successful cartel of cities. It delivered cheap bulk in dangerous seas. It had enough muscle to fight pirates and kings. It laid down the daily protocols that let strangers trade with strangers and still sleep at night. It left behind more law than legend and more brick than banner. It did not invent capitalism. It did teach Northern Europe to act like a marketplace first and a battlefield second. Last, the numbers that cling hardest are the tangible ones. Around 4 contours define the Hanse's foreign presence. London's Steelyard, Bruges' contour, later shadowed by Antwerp, Bergen's Briggen, and Novgorod's Peterhof. Dozens of letters and treaties lock their rights in place. From Frederick II's 1226 charter to petitions in Bruges in 1347 and the Stralsund Treaty in 1370, roughly 70 to 90 cities are regulars at diets. Over 200 touched the network in some fashion between the 13th and 16th centuries. A cog can carry 150 tons. A season at Scania yields tens of thousands of barrels of herring at the peak in the 13th and 14th centuries. Sound dues chip a reliable revenue stream into the Danish crown's ledger from 1429 until the 19th century, with collections carefully recorded ship by ship at Helsingør. The Bergen contour outlives the League's politics by 2 centuries, closing in 1754 with a sigh of tradition that had simply outlasted its point. There is a temptation to stamp the Han as an early European Union. The metaphor flatters everyone. The reality is sharper and more interesting. This was a messy alliance of towns that mostly agreed to keep their neighbours rich enough not to burn each other's fleets. The firepower was economic, the constitution was a pile of minutes, and the anthem was the sound of rope over a capstan. The League ends, if endings need a date, with the last General Diet in 1669. That is the administrative bow tied off. In reputational terms, it never ends. A shipowner in Hamburg writes invoices in neat type and signs them in a city still called free and Hanseatic. Lübeck's museum shelves with salt-stained ledgers draw lines from medieval cogs to container ships. Briggen's wooden bones echo with guided groups who walk where contraldermen once counted stockfish and lectured novices about honesty and barrel sizes. The tone that comes through the centuries is simple. Do the deal, keep the books, protect the route, be ready to sail at dawn. In a world that loves flashy conquerors, the Hans built something sturdier. It made promises hold. It made markets habitual. It played the long game with a short sail and a deep ledger. And when kings tried to lean on it, it leaned back with ships, statutes, and a stare that said prices rise when privileges fall. That was its influence. That was its development. That remains its style. Our journey through history continues with the rise of the Tang Dynasty, Golden Age of China. A golden age kicks off with murder at a gate on the 2nd of July, 626. Arrows flew at the Xuanwu Gate in Chang'an. 2 princes lay dead, Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji, and their brother Li Shimin stood over the wreckage, cold and efficient. By nightfall, the father, Lai Yuan, had effectively retired. The court had received new marching orders, and the Tang Dynasty had set its trajectory. Historians call it the Xuanwu Gate incident. People who prefer their history sanitized call it a dynastic transition. The old Book of Tang reads like AR paperwork. The reality looks closer to a throne carved with a composite bow. From that ugly beginning, a gorgeous century unfurled. The Tang, 618. To part, 907 ended up coordinating an empire of roughly 50 million people by the mid-8th century census. The 742 count records 9 million households, which scholars estimate as about 50-60 million individuals, and set standards for law, culture, and bureaucracy that neighboring states studied like exam crammers. Chang'an and Luan glowed like circuit boards at night. Okay, not literally. Curfew compounded the dark. Yet the administrative system clicked with a sophistication that still impresses legal historians. Here is the punchline that keeps repeating. Brilliance built on blood and logistics. Everyone's origin story claims destiny. The Tang had an engineering diagram. The Sui dynasty, 581-680, before them had done the heavy lifting. Reunified China, dug the Grand Canal, nearly killed the state with forced labor and disastrous invasions of Goguryeo. When the Sui imploded, ambitious governors rose everywhere. Li Yuan, Duke of Tang and head of the powerful Guanlong military aristocracy of northwest China, ethnically mixed with Xianbei and Turkic ties, walked into Chang'an in 617, declared the Tang the next dynasty in 618, and swore to calm the mess. That promise wobbled until Li Shimin, the second son, with better instincts and sharper archery, removed his brothers and took the dragon seat as Emperor Taizong. 626. 649. His first priority was survival. He placated steppe allies, then dismantled them. In 630, Tang forces and the general Li Jing shattered the Eastern Turkic Khaganate at the Battle of Yinshan, and the steppes suddenly contained far more Tang banners. For a moment, the Turkic tribes called Taizong the Tian Care, the Heavenly Kagan. That title still stuns. The Chinese emperor wore 2 crowns in the 630s. Son of Heaven in Chang'an and Kagan by steppe acclamation. The new Book of Tang and Ziji Tongjian both preserve the strut in the prose. This was not chest-thumping for its own sake. Taizong's empire ran on a policy model that became a template. Power balanced between court and frontier. Carrot and stick diplomacy with nomads. Strong law matched with a systematic bureaucracy. Fiscal policy that allowed peasants to plough and the state to eat. The Tang Code, promulgated in 653, organized 12 sections and about 500 articles with a genius for clarity. Imagine a legal system that assigns punishment not only by the crime, but by the social status involved, the offender's circumstances, and even age. It codified the 10 abominations and the 8 deliberations, then outlined mitigation rules like an algorithm. Heaviness where needed, precision everywhere. Later dynasties copied it, Japan and Korea adapted it. Legal historians still grin when they turn its pages. The economic base mattered just as much. The equal field system allocated land to households for tax purposes. It did not create a socialist utopia. It made spreadsheets of farmland. People received plots based on household size and reclaimed them at death or after a fixed term. In theory, the state could then assess grain, labor, and cloth taxes predictably. A militia system called fubing rotated peasant soldiers for defense. Early Tang coinage, the Kaiyan Tongbao, minted under Emperor Gaozu in 621, smoothed cash transactions. It served so well that versions circulated for centuries, even influencing coinage in Japan. The whole organism had a capital to match. Chang'an, modern Xi'an, sprawled across roughly 78 square kilometers, a carefully gridded city of about 108 walled wards called Fang, each gated and policed. The East Market and West Market covered around a square kilometer apiece, regulated like financial districts. Many sources estimate Chang's population as between 800,000 and over 1 million at its height. The city ran curfews, banned casual night markets in early centuries, and scheduled commercial hours. This was not exactly a laissez-faire vibe, and yet its controlled bustle attracted people from everywhere. Sobjians in bright collars, Persian traders, Korean scholars, Japanese envoys, Tibetans with serious horses, monks from Nalanda, carrying rolled sutras, and a full buffet of anyone else with goods and nerve. The 781 Nestorian stele stands as physical proof of Christian communities. Muslim, Zoroastrian, and Manichaean groups also lived in designated quarters. That glow of cosmopolitanism rests on text and stone, not just myth. Literati love to start a Tang story with poetry and tea. That would be too gentle here. First comes the machinery, then the music. Still, the verse breaks through quickly. By the mid-7th century, court ceremonies required poetry like oxygen. Poets later known as the Immortals. Li Bai, 701, 762. Du Fu, 712, 770. Wang Wei, 699, 759, would dominate the 8th century, but even earlier, the atmosphere felt charged. It is fashionable to quote Li Bai's moonlit melancholy and pretend the Tang lived in a bath of lyric wistfulness. The reality involves heavy cavalry, tax registers, and ward curfews. Then the poems, like fireworks over a military base. Taizong himself invited argument at court and preserved a record of ministerial criticism that later emperors glowered at. The Zixi Tongjian preserves scenes of remonstrance, and historians savor a ruler willing to record his own scoldings. This high tone did not mean he operated by democratic consensus. He shot his brothers and took the throne. He practiced both governance and stagecraft, and the combination worked. Tang expansion continued under his son, Gaozong. Rare, 649, 683. Conquests dotted the map. Korea, Vietnam, Central Asia, all targets of Tang policy. Sometimes successful, sometimes trivial, sometimes catastrophically expensive. Baki fell in 660. Goguryeo fell in 668. For a moment, a Tang protectorate, to pacify the East, tried to administer parts of the Korean peninsula. Silla, the Tang ally, then decided permanent Chinese oversight, felt like a bad roommate and fought the Tang. By 676, the Tang withdrew, and Silla unified Korea under its own terms. On the map, antibodies had formed. To the southwest, Tang advanced into Annan, northern Vietnam, where later rebellions flared and receded. In Central Asia, the Protectorate to pacify the West planted Tang garrisons in Kucha, Kashgar, Karashar, and Khotan, and a Tang general, Su Dingfang, defeated the Western Turkic Khaganate in 657. The highways of silk and horseflesh kept humming until highland rivals knocked them aside. Then Henge creaked, and a different kind of rule showed its face. Empress Wu Zetian stepped into command, officially ruling as emperor from 690 to 705, under her self-declared Zhou dynasty. She had been a consort to Taizong, then made her way to power as the consort, and eventually the political spine of Gaozong. Historians have argued for 1,000 years about her reputation, and the arguments tell just as much about later attitudes toward women as about Wu herself. The record shows both ruthless purges and sharp policy. She used Buddhism for ideological leverage, elevating sutras like the Great Cloud Sutra to justify the rule of a reincarnated Maitreya-style monarch. She promoted officials by examination, showily cutting back the aristocratic clans. She launched public works, reinforced the examination system, and maintained the empire with generally competent administrators. The New Book of Tang, compiled under Song editorial eyes, tuts at her. Modern historians reading the same sources see a ruler within the normal range of imperial ruthlessness, only female, and thus rendered monstrous by some chroniclers. Wu ended up one of the most consequential rulers of the age. She also never ordered nightingale-shaped flamethrowers or whatever later opera suggested. The bureaucracy did not care about gender when it stamped seals. Back to the classics of control, the civil service examinations in the Tang did not turn every bright farm boy into a minister. They pried open cracks in aristocratic monopolies. In the early 7th century, the Jinsh degree might see under 30 successful candidates in a year. By the late 9th century, the number often rose above 100. The exams tested literary skill and Confucian classics, rewarding fluency in regulated verse and parallel prose. That emphasis has generated modern eye rolls from anyone who prefers engineering. Yet those exam cohorts formed a remarkably cohesive class, with shared values and record-keeping zeal. The names fill pages in the old and new books of Tang with almost obscene thoroughness. Then came Emperor Xuanzong, 712-756, temple name Minghuang. He presided over the Kaiyuan era, 713 to 741, which later authors called the apex. Kaiyuan means opening of the origin, and that tone of fresh lacquered promise saturates every story. He centralized finances under able ministers like Yao Chong and Zhang Juling, expanded the Hanlin Academy, and maintained the equal field tax flows as long as they could be maintained. Population. The 742 census sits there like a trophy. 9 million households, the high watermark. The coin base stabilized. The markets of Chang'an thrived, and music from Central Asia electrified court dances. Xuanzong established the Pear Garden, Lyon, a royal academy for music and performance around 714. Later actors called themselves disciples of the Pear Garden, which is one of those cultural fossils that quietly survive dynasties. This is where the aesthetics explode. Silk garments with Central Asian cuts, women's fashion that angles toward horse riding, and bold hairpins. Cosmetics as art. If the museum image of the Tang looks vivid and full-figured, that is not a fantasy. Paintings and tomb murals from the 8th century favor warmth over austerity. The famous lychee runs for consort Yang Yuhua, a woman later called Yang Gifei, born 719, almost certainly happened in some form. The imperial relay system could dash fresh lychees from Lingnan northward. In days, a feat of logistics, the poetry turned into legend. The poet Dumu, writing in the 9th century, sketched the indulgence with half a smile. Emperors preferred both display and performance. That does not mean Xuanzong lost the thread. Early in his reign, he balanced accounts like a stern bookkeeper. The intellectual bloom radiated outward. Abdullah ibn al-Muqaffa did not visit Chang'an, but his peers in the Abbasid world would recognize the energy. The Tang world saw printed Dynasty spells by the 700s. The Diamond Sutra, printed in 868, is the oldest known complete printed book with a date. Excavated from a cave in Dunhuang, paper itself long predated the Tang. Kai Lun's improvement under the Han sits at 105 C by tradition. Woodblock printing in Tang turned a literate class into a distributive network. Lu Yu wrote the classic of tea, Cha Jing, around the 760s, systematizing a drink that had been medicine and ritual into a daily habit. From a monk's brew, then a connoisseur's niche, tea slid into daily life, and the Tang wrote down how. The text still reads like politely intense nerd enthusiasm. Buddhism reached a cultural peak. The monk Xuanzang left Chang'an in 629 on an unauthorized trip to India, returned in 645, dragging 657 texts, and set up a translation bureau under imperial protection. He helped build the Great Wild Goose Pagoda in 652 to store sutras, and his record of the western regions offered an ethnographic survey that modern Indologists still mine. Huayan Buddhism flourished under masters like Fazan, 643-712, while Chan Zen evolved through figures such as Huining, 613-713, although later hagiography inflated their silhouettes. That is the trick with Tang. The sources are as lush as the murals, and the category of embellishment exists for a reason. It looks invincible from a distance. That view dissolves on contact with the frontier. Tibet punched the Tang repeatedly. In 670, the Tibetan Empire dealt the Tang a harsh defeat at Dafei River, then clawed much of the Tarim Basin out of Tang control. The two empires wrestled for decades. In 763, while the Tang still reeled from internal revolt, Tibetan forces actually seized Chang'an briefly. The fact that the A-list capital of East Asia fell to a neighbor says everything about the vulnerability built into this golden age. The crisis arrives with a name, and Lushan, born around 703, of Sogdian and Turkic background, a military governor who spoke to power with the casual ease of a man who could field an army. He commanded frontier forces in Fanyang, Pinglu, and Hedong. Estimates place his troops around 150,000 to 200,000 before revolt. The relationship with the court got cozy, then rancid. In 755, he launched a rebellion, declared a rival state called Yan, and by 756, his armies had taken Luoyang and Chankan. Emperor Xuanzong fled to Sichuan. The empire cried uncle to the Uyghur Khaganate for help, and Uyghur cavalry helped Tang generals Guozi and Li Guangbi retake the capitals in 757. The price included humiliating looting by the saviors, and Lushan died in 757, assassinated by his own son. But the rebellion dragged on until 763, finally ending after his successor, Shi Chaoi, committed suicide. Numbers tell the devastation better than adjectives. The 742 census recorded roughly 9 million households. The 764 count plummets to around 2 million households. Scholars point out underreporting and administrative collapse. But even corrected estimates suggest tens of millions dropped out of tax rolls. That loss implies mass displacement, deaths from famine and war, and administrative fragmentation. This is not romantic. This is an empire losing bone density overnight. The Tang survived, but the state regrew on bad angles. The shock changed everything. The equal field and fubbing systems could not survive. Tang administrators moved to a cash-based solution known as the two-tax reform of 780 under the finance minister Yang Yan. Taxes fell twice a year, assessed on property and actual land held rather than on household headcounts. Lighten the exactions, widen the net, and make the math simple enough to enforce. The army shifted to long-service professionals on the frontiers, commanded by regional military governors, the Jaidushi. It sounded pragmatic. It created warlords with payrolls. In an empire the size of Western Europe, that turned provincial capitals into gravitational wells. Money made this new arrangement run. The central government leaned hard on the salt monopoly. In the late 8th and 9th centuries, salt revenues delivered perhaps half or more of the government's cash income in some years, collected via salt certificates that merchants bought and passed on to consumers. Salt kept armies in boots. It also encouraged corruption on a scale that poets knew how to mock. A dynasty that started with legal precision found itself negotiating bribes with functionally independent strongmen. The Tang still wore the right robes, but the seams showed. This is the point for myth-busting, because the Tang attracts beautiful misunderstandings. The civil service exams did not instantly flatten aristocratic privilege. Early Tang high offices remained dominated by old noble clans. The exam opened more seats as the centuries passed, and by the late 9th century the Jinch degree had real clout. The aristocrats did not evaporate overnight. They learned to write better. Foot binding is not a Tang pastime. That fashion emerges in the song. Tang women rode horses, played polo, and appear in art with both strength and variety. Bound feet belong to a later chapter. The Battle of Talas in 751 did not end Chinese presence in Central Asia by magical decree, nor did it bring paper to the Islamic world as a single event. The Tang general Gao Xianzhi fought Abbasid and Karluk forces by the Talas River and lost when the Karluks switched sides. Tang positions in Central Asia were already under pressure from Tibetans and internal strains. Knowledge of paper-making spread west, gradually through trade and migration. Talas appears as a colourful narrative, turning point in later accounts, but archaeology and textual evidence indicate a slower diffusion. Gunpowder did not leap fully formed from a Tang court fireworks display. Late Tang alchemical texts describe formulas producing dangerous fire mixtures. The full weaponization occurs in Song military treatises, like the Wujing Zongyao of 1044. The Tang provided the laboratory and plenty of cautionary explosions. The Song turned the stuff into munitions. The Tang's pure Han Chinese golden age ignores how multi-ethnic the court and the capital felt. Sogdian merchants, Turkic guards, Persian musicians, and foreign religions were part of the scene. The Tang made synthesis a strategy. Culture did not take a vacation during the political migraines. Du Fu's poems record the An Lushan catastrophe with documentary precision. Hungry families, displaced officials, an empire trying to breathe again. Li Bai's work floats above the carnage with wine and starshine, but his life got twisted by exile and politics. Wan Wei balanced Buddhist serenity with painterly eye. Bai Juyi 772-800 and 46 later wrote social critique so clear that his poems went viral across East Asia. If a poem can go viral by boat and courier, his Song of Everlasting Sorrow, composed in 806, immortalized Yang Guifei and the Emperor, rendering a messy political tragedy into tragic, tender myth. Visual art kept pace. Sansai. Three-color, lead glazed earthenware horses and camels swaggered in tombs, their glazes pooling like caramel and jade. Court painting credited Wu Daozi, c. 659, with brush control, so legendary that later artists invented stories about him, painting dragons that flew off walls. In pottery, northern kilns, like Xing's, produced brilliant whitewares. Southern kilns, like Yue, perfected celadon. These are not just museum pieces. They are the daily dishes of a great city, posing as eternal civilization. Cosmopolitanism was not simply an inland fashion. Maritime trade boomed through ports like Guangzhou and Quanzhou. Muslim and Persian merchants established communities by the 8th century. The Huasheng Mosque in Guangzhou carries a tradition back to the 7th century, though surviving structures date later. The government ran foreigner quarters called Hanfang and supervised trade with a light or heavy hand, depending on the year and the minister. In 1878, the rebel Huang Chao's forces sacked Guangzhou and massacred foreign merchants in numbers. The sources inflate, but even conservative estimates show the depth of cosmopolitan risk. Long-distance trade brought wealth, faith, and vulnerability in one package. Religion bent with politics. The anti-Buddhist persecutions of 845 under Emperor Wuzong wrecked thousands of temples. Sources quote 4,600 monasteries and 40,000 smaller temples and shrines closed and forced hundreds of thousands of monks and nuns back into lay life. The state did not suddenly hate compassion. It wanted tax revenue and labor back on the registers, and some ministers, fueled by Taoist zeal, aimed to curb monastic wealth. The persecution hit real communities and left real scars. Buddhism survived, trimmed, and rolled forward into the Song, with Chan's spare style and Pure Land's easy devotion. The intellectual climate shows a second wind. Hanyu, 768-824, preached a Confucian revival, attacking Buddhism and promoting a return to classical prose. His essay Memorial on the Bone of the Buddha nearly got him executed in 819 for lecturing the emperor about a relic procession. He lived, demoted but loud. The prose movement he spearheaded shaped Tang and songwriting so thoroughly that later readers forget how fresh his voice sounded. Culture remains a balance of market taste and moral nagging, and the Tang curated both. That re-empowered moral voice tried to domesticate a political mess. After the An Lushan rebellion, the Jidushi system hardened into semi-autonomous fiefdoms. The central court sometimes played them off against one another. Sometimes it paid tribute in all but name. Under Emperor Senzong, 805-820, campaigns restored some authority. Under later rulers, it slipped again. An empire that had once told Turks where to sit at court found itself writing flattering letters to provincial warlords to keep grain moving. The new book of Tang reads the later reigns like a careful obituary. Respectful phrasing, tragic undertones, too many names of minor insurrections. Meanwhile, the everyday engine stayed creative. The state printed calendars and religious texts. Local workshops produced ink and brushes, as vital to governance as swords. Navigational attitudes edged forward. Shipbuilding improved under the pull of maritime trade. Agricultural manuals circulated. Tea shops became social hubs, while wine shops hosted scholars who pretended to detest commerce. Urban amusements flourished, from shadow plays to mixed ensembles of piper, flute, and drum performing Central Asian tunes. The famous Hukshuan, the whirling foreign dance, spun across palace floors with athletic bravado that shocked Confucian conservatives and delighted everyone else. Law remained more than theatre. The Tang Code's structure, clear crimes, graded penalties, careful procedural notes impressed even later critics. Punishments included caning, penal, servitude, exile, and death, with degrees that correlated to family status and mitigating circumstances. The code defined relational duty with granularity that modern legal scholars admire and dread. In one sense, the whole governance of the Tang designed itself to predict behavior by category. Humans refuse to behave on schedule and ruin the model, as humans tend to do. In international terms, the Tang's footprint changed shape. In Japan, envoys called Kintoshi ran from 630 until 894, soaking up Tang laws, music, and city planning. Nara, Haijō-kyo, founded 710, and Heiin-kyo, Kyoto, founded 794, borrowed Chang'an's grid like a student borrowing notes. Japanese court music, gagaku, absorbed Tang repertory as if shipping crates were sheet music. In Korea, Silla internalized the learning while keeping its independence. In Vietnam, rebellions, like that of Phun Khoa in the 8th century, showed both the draw and the strain of Tang overlordship. These names sit in footnotes unless the empire flinched. The Tang flinched often and stayed relevant even more often. The closing act arrives not in one blow, but in a string of body shots. Financial strain mounted, droughts hit, and peasant revolts combustible from tax pressure and local predation erupted. The salt monopoly's centrality warped the economy. Eunuch influence at court ballooned as they controlled the palace army, the Shent's guards, and manipulated succession. High ministers wrote eloquent essays about moral order while begging provincial generals for troops. Then the Huangchao Rebellion, 884, smashed what remained of central confidence. Huang, a failed exam candidate turned salt smuggler, assembled armies that took city after city, even captured Chang'an in 81. He declared a new state, named himself emperor, and overseen chaos that left claw marks across the empire's tax base and psyche. When the rebel tide receded, Tang authority looked like a palace facade propped by scaffolding. After 880, the dynasty lurched. Semi-independent regimes sprouted in the provinces. The prestigious title, Tang, became a brand different figures wore while fielding their own payrolls. Finally, in 907, the warlord Zhu Wen forced the last Tang emperor, Ai, to abdicate. The 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period began, a fragmentation that would last until 960. The Tang fell, famously and definitively. The antique phrase would say, heaven withdrew its mandate. A modern footnote would mention logistics and organizational decay. Either way, the curtain dropped, and yet the afterlife of Tang glows as brightly as its murals. In Cantonese, overseas Chinese communities call themselves Tang people, Tom Yan. In Vietnamese, the Chinese written characters became Trug, Han, and the older word for China, Juving, reflects the Tang. In Japanese, Tang-style goods became karamana, and even the shorthand To speaks the name. The legal architecture of the Tang Code influenced Japan's rituary system and Korea's Goryeo statutes. The verse forms of Tang poets became mandatory reading for centuries across East Asia. The Chang'an city plan remains a hidden blueprint under the modern Xi'an grid, like a pop song that becomes a standard. The Tang lodged itself in the regional ear, then kept getting covered by later dynasties. The cult of Tang still carries goofy myths, so here is one more round of surgical cleanup with receipts. Chang'an did not host a permanent all-night party. The city enforced curfews and ward controls for most of the dynasty. Night markets became more common in later Tang, when enforcement slackened. The capital could throw a festival with the best of them, but the default setting was orderly, not neon. The Tang did not invent paper money. Paper promissory notes existed as private instruments in the late Tang, but government-issued paper currency belongs to the Song in the 11th century. The Tang printed sutras and calendars and maybe lottery-style tally slips. They did not run a fiat money experiment. Aristocratic decline was real but gradual. The Guanlong families of the northwest and other pedigree clans carried disproportionate weight at court through the 8th century. Exam graduates gained weight later, particularly after the shock of 755 exposed the need for a broader pool. Taoist alchemy in the Tang did not consist purely of laughable immortality pills. It produced some terrifying chemistry, including dangerously combustible mixtures that would become gunpowder, and also some fairly effective elixirs that did not kill anyone immediately. The empirical method lurked inside the search for immortality. The Tang did not own Central Asia continuously. Control waxed and waned. The protectorate to pacify the West had its glory decades in the mid-7th century. Tibetan pressure curtailed Tang presence significantly. After 670, the Talis defeat mattered, but structural strain mattered more. Back on stage, the sheer quality of Tang governance, at its best, deserves a close-up. Officials like Jan Swin Wuji, a key architect of the Tang Code, embodied a cerebral approach to power that translated philosophy into regulation. Ministers like Yao Chong managed finances with crisp rules that made state capacity visible. The Hanlin Academy formed a brain trust that could draft an edict in the morning and appraise a painting in the afternoon. The idea of a literati elite vested with cultural authority and political responsibility crystallized here. That idea worked when the army listened. It failed when the army paid itself. Even the empire's attempt to manage markets reveals its careful mind. Markets in Chang'an and Luoyang opened and closed by the drum. Literally, price control mechanisms. Ever-normal granaries and stabilization granaries allowed officials to buy grain in good years and sell in lean ones, smoothing spikes. The system did not prevent famine, but it embodied the principle that the state's legitimacy involved making rice affordable. Later, Chinese states revived versions of this as policy muscle memory. Economics textbooks rarely start with Tang administrators. They probably should. Tang foreign policy had a rhythm. Dominate the steppe, buffer the highlands, manage the sea. During the strong stretch, it worked beautifully. When the rhythm faltered, the frontier hammered the core. The marriage politics with the steppe, the so-called Hekin arrangements, never fully vanished, but victories like 630 against the Eastern Turks let the Tang dictate terms. By the 740s, the Uyghur Khaganate dominated the Mongolian steppe. The Tang forged alliances when it suited, then regretted the bill. In 757, when Uyghur horsemen helped retake the capitals from Lushan's rebels, their payment including significant looting, allies deliver with interest rates. Underneath all this, the Tang defined the role of the state in culture with unusual confidence. Court-sponsored music research. Official histories compiled on schedule, including the Book of Sui in 636, a translation bureau for Buddhist scriptures, curated by men who balanced Sanskrit grammar and palace politics at the same desk. The platform for this cultural production was an empire machine humming at low frequencies, relay stations on the post roads, warehouses stacked with paper, an exam calendar shaping adolescent ambitions, a coin that felt right in the hand. Civilization looks glamorous on the surface. It hums because of logistics. Consider the city again. Because Changjian is the star that never gets enough light. The grid divided life into spatial units. Words for residents, markets for trade, palaces for power. Each ward had an internal life. Neighbors, small shrines, gossip networks running faster than officials. Sogdian communities ran their own fairs, staged their own festivals. Chinese families married in, rich and poor, artifacts from tombs around Xi'an, glass beakers likely imported from the Islamic world, silver ewers with vine motifs, tri-colored camels with Sogdian riders, scream hybridity. The Tang did not pretend to purity. It curated plurality and called it order. Then there is the sensory register. Silk against skin in summer heat. Streets that smelled of perfumed hair and horse sweat. Flutes from Kucha, setting the rhythm while drums beat time. Monks chanting in Sanskrit tones, tuned for Chinese tongues. Tea boiled with a little salt, whisked in a bowl, taken like medicine and conversation both. In a city that regulated markets with iron hands, pleasure found woven pathways. Governance recorded itself constantly. The Zizhi Tongjin, compiled in the 11th century by Sima Guang, draws on Tang records to narrate the period with meticulous care. That compilation reads like a manual for statesmen who want to avoid the fate of rulers who took their eye off logistics. It catalogues rebellions, court debates, and the shapes of policy anchored by the bland terror of dates. The Old Book of Tang, completed 945, and the New Book of Tang, completed 1060, supply biographies that sometimes smear and sometimes canonize. They define memory as argument. No one should romanticize the brutality. The Tang executed people. It tortured. It relocated populations. It treated frontier peoples with paternalistic formulas, mixed with real respect and savvy manipulation. The code carved out privileges for the elite, then punished commoners with a heavier hand. The state reached for control and often grabbed hard, but within those constraints, a flexible, sophisticated civilization extended trust to talent, promoted writing as a kind of civic virtue, and could make a monastic librarian into a court advisor. For a medieval state, that looks almost modern. Morally speaking, the Tang enjoyed its contradictions. It celebrated Confucian hierarchy, then let Buddhists preach compassion and Taoists brew immortality. It valorized frugality in edicts, then rolled laches to a favorite consort at breakneck speed. It built a legal code that emphasized order, then outsourced force to frontier generals. It wrote poems about leaving office for rustic retreats, then made office the only path to status that mattered. It staged pageants about virtue while bribery bought postings. The contradictions do not cancel the achievements. They explain the texture. Decline created innovations. The two-tax system stabilized cash flow. The salt monopoly system pioneered fiscal instruments that later regimes refined into salt certificates tradable in markets. Local elites stepped into governance as the court lost reach, and those local elites developed their own institutions, sometimes benevolent, sometimes predatory. If it looks like a dry precursor to state capacity exercises in modern economic history, that is not accidental. The lineage runs straight. One last sweep across the map captures the international echo. In Central Asia, Sogdians kept trading under Tang, Tibetan, Arab, and Uyghur flags, pivoting as needed. In the Islamic world, paper-making centers like Samarkand blossomed in the 8th-9th centuries. Where the talas mattered as a single moment, the trend is clear. In Korea and Japan, Tang models kept shaping capitals and law codes for centuries. In Vietnam, Chinese rule in Yunnan remained intermittent, with local leaders establishing the position that would eventually become Vietnamese independence. For neighbors, the Tang meant both school and mourning. The fall in 907 feels like an ending, because the official Somme tells it that way. A dynasty begins with a rebel who has the better plan, rises to cosmic balance, then fails because of hubris and neglect. The Tang story does not sit neatly inside that morality play. It rises on murder and good policy. It flourishes on cosmopolitan appetite and administrative discipline. It stumbles on military outsourcing and fiscal stress. It ends because men with troops and accountants no longer needed the brand. The people who survived it, farmers, artisans, porters, poets, kept living, writing and pouring tea. The Song dynasty would inherit much of the Tang's hardware and some of its software, then innovate where the Tang cracked. In the end, the rise of the Tang looks less like a straight climb and more like a roller coaster engineered by legalists with excellent taste. It starts with a prince at a gate and ends with regional strongmen trimming banners off the palace eaves. In between, a staggering amount of beauty and clarity emerges. The code that lawyers admire, the poems that teenagers still memorize, the city plan that urbanists sketch in lectures, the drumbeat of markets and the quiet calculus of taxes. Li Shimin's ruthless arrow becomes Li Bai's drifting moon, then flips back into Guozi's battle standard, then resolves into Lu Yu's porcelain bowl. The Tang built a civilization that managed to be both organized and alive. Every golden age has a price. The Tang paid it in frontier wars, internal bloodletting, and bureaucratic strain. It also paid attention to law, to art, to the details of city life. That combination is rare. The golden part sticks less because the empire was wealthy than because it understood how to turn memory into institution. The best proof is that neighbors and heirs kept copying it, and age truly rises when imitation becomes reflex. The Tang still sits there, a dangerous, dazzling model, reminding later states that law and lyric can share a desk, and that a world of many languages and one code can hum for a century if the relay stations stay stocked and the drums beat on time. Sources for that hum sit in plain sight. The Old Book of Tang and New Book of Tang fill shelves with biographies and institutional notes. The Ziji Tongjian stitches the timeline with excruciating care. The Nestorian stele from 781 speaks stone. The 868 Diamond Sutra whispers from woodblock ink. Lu Yu's Cha-Jing explains one drink as if peace depended on it. Dunhuang manuscripts exhale the everyday breath of a frontier oasis. A single dynasty will never boil down to one lesson. But the Tang offers a clear suggestion. Organize well. Welcome the world. Never outsource too much force. And do not forget the gate where the story began. The blood there is not the point. The planning after it is. And now, let's continue with our next story. The influence of the Minoan civilization on Greece. It starts with a bull, a labyrinth, and a whole lot of concrete. Not a metaphor. Arthur Evans literally poured reinforced concrete over the ruins of Knossos in 1905 and painted a prince with lilies who never really existed as a single figure. The modern image of the Minoans came preloaded with glossy frescoes, pastel dolphins, and a mythic glow. The story that sticks to the mind goes like this. Gentle islanders who hated war, danced with bulls, then vanished into the sea like a Bronze Age Atlantis. The reality runs deeper, stranger, and far more influential on what later became Greece. Step onto Crete around 1700 Bash, and the air smells like olive oil, sea salt, and wet gypsum. The Palace of Knossos sprawls over roughly 14,000 square meters, a maze of magazines packed with pithoi, the size of hot tubs, storerooms sliced by long corridors, and light wells that throw shafts of sun across terracotta floors. Down the coast at Faistos, on the Masera plain, and up at Malia, the same palatial rhythm beats. Central courts big enough to stage spectacles. Pier and door partitions that let rooms expand like an accordion, and frescoes that pull the eyes into a world of bright reds, cobalt blues, and sharp white outlines. The island's mountains hold peak centuries with wind biting the skin and offerings piled in rough stone enclosures. Between palace and hilltop stands a society that organizes labor at a scale the Aegean had not seen. Administrators tally grain, oil, wool, and people. Scribes score signs onto clay, in scripts, still half a riddle. The influence that pours out of this infrastructure flows everywhere the Aegean wind blows. Minoans teach the neighbors how to do bureaucracy with a flourish. They turn raw materials into status objects, and then they pitch those objects across the water like a fever dream of modern branding. Their symbols, their art, the way they move through landscape and sea, all of it leaves fingerprints on the Greeks who follow. They even leave marks on Egypt's walls. In the tomb of Rekhmire at Thebes, painted around the mid-15th century Bess, men labelled Keftiu, almost certainly Cretans, shuffle forward with metal vessels, gold cups, and carved stone writer. They wear flounced kilts and ratio-defying waistlines. Basically the Bronze Age runway look. Similar processions parade in the tombs of Menkaperine and Senenmut. The Egyptians, who tracked exotic imports like a customs office with hieroglyphs, knew that Crete sat out there trading hard. The Minoan toolkit that matters most for later Greece starts with writing. They test multiple scripts, because one is never enough. Cretan hieroglyphic pops up in the early 2nd millennium BC, with little picture signs stamped into seals. Linear A follows, flowing in neat lines of syllabic signs and numbers. Linear A is not cracked, and every few years a brave soul claims to hear it whisper Greek or Luwian or something else. But the consensus says the language behind it is not Greek. That sounds like a dead end, until Greek speakers show up on Crete and borrow the whole idea, tweaking signs until they map to Mycenaean Greek. Now the script is called Linear B. Around 1952, Michael Ventris and John Chadwick prove it, and suddenly the palace records talk. The earliest Greek writing in history exists because Minoans built the habit of recording shipments, sheep, and workforce quotas on damp clay that accidentally fired to permanence in palace fires. That little administrative revolution rewires the mainland. At Pylos, Mycenae, Thebes, and eventually Knossos itself under new management, after about 1450 BC, Linear B tablets swarm with numbers. They list bronzesmiths in clusters, wool outputs by district, rations of wine and grain for workers, and the dreaded collectors who squeeze taxes like pros. The bureaucratic DNA comes from Crete's palatial systems. The Greeks absorbed the ledger spirit while steering it in their own direction. More fortification walls, more war gear, more palatial hierarchy. Yet the scribal nerves running through it are Minoan inspired. The gods themselves slip through this administrative doorway. In Linear B tablets, many deities look familiar. Daiwi, Zeus, Poseidon, no, Poseidon, Atana, Potini, Ja, Athena, Aspotnia, Ra, Hera, Paya, Paya, where, Hera, Paya, Paya, where, Paya, where, Hera, Paya, 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 where. Paya, 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 and E-re-U-T. Jar, ally fire. Padmir, the mistress, appears again and again, a kind of title that sings back to earlier Minoan cults, where a dominant goddess holds snakes, perches in trees, or stands on mountain peaks as a counterpart to animals and wind. Later Greeks keep the names and layer their own stories on top. But under the mythology lies continuity. Homer places Eileithy's cave at Amnisos outside Knossos in Odyssey 19, a detail that sounds like a memory older than epic verse. Even the dance lives on the shield of Achilles in the Iliad, where Hephaestus forges a chorus like the one Daedalus made for Ariadne, a detail scholars have beaten to death because it feels specific, localized, like someone really saw something on Crete and could not forget it. The shape of ritual looks Minoan too. Horns of consecration sprout everywhere in Minoan sites. Stylized bull horns crowning walls and altars. Double axes, labries, hang like badges of thundering power. Bull leaping dominates the frescoes in Knossos. The bull mid-arc, human bodies launching over the back with gymnastic defiance. The image repelled and seduced Arthur Evans in equal measure. And it still has people squinting. In later Greek myth, the labyrinth and minotaur do the heavy lifting for cultural memory, but the symbols are already there in stone and plaster. The word labyrinth likely connects to labris, the double axe. A philological knot scholars love to argue with measured intensity, but the resonance is undeniable. Somewhere in the murk between late Bronze Age rituals and archaic storytelling, a real bull cult, a palace with a floor plan like a circuit board, and a king named Minos become a myth that Athens turns into an origin story about slaying monsters. The marriage of art and influence runs hot. Mainland palaces start hiring Minoan painters or local artists who learned Minoan tricks. Wall frescoes at Pylos around 1300 BC glow with octopuses, griffins, and procession scenes that could slot into a corridor at Knossos with only a color correction. The Vafeo cups, golden masterpieces from a Tholos tomb in Laconia, dated roughly 1500 to 1450 B, carry scenes of bull capture in a flowing, almost cinematic style that looks straight out of a Cretan atelier, whether imported or executed by someone trained in the Cretan visual grammar. A small but devastating object proves the point at a microscopic level. The Pylos combat agate from the Griffin warrior tomb, carved around 1450 BC, depicts two fighters and a fallen foe with detail, so fine that some lines measure less than a hair's breadth. The stone is Minoan in style and iconography. The man in the tomb is Mycenaean elite. The fusion screen's influence so loud it practically rattles the glass case. Architecture passes through the same filter. Minoan palaces have that central court plan and software-like flexibility indoors, with pier and door partitions that let someone change the social script of a space in minutes. Mycenaean palaces prefer the Minoan, a ceremonial hall with a front porch and a central hearth. Yet, the way the mainland elites decorate and equip those rooms shows Minoan fingerprints. Storage technologies, lustral basins, gypsum revetments that give walls a marble glow, and an entire taste profile for interior decoration cross the water. Even two-mark architecture nods south. In southern Crete's Masara plain, circular Tholos tombs appear by the 3rd millennium bus and run forward into the 2nd. Later, on the mainland, Tholos tombs with corbelled domes explode in size, Think the treasury of Atreus at Mycenae around 1250 bus, 40 meters long and a chamber over 13 meters tall. And plenty of archaeologists see a conceptual lineage that begins on Crete. The mainland turns the circle into a monument, big enough to flex on neighbors, but the idea already had mileage in Cretan cemeteries. The economy does not just expand, it upgrades. Minoans manage textiles like a boss-level sim game. Wool flows through palace magazines, then out as beautifully finished cloth that shows off when worn by Cretans in paintings abroad. Measuring systems develop on weights that track Near Eastern standards, but settle into Aegean patterns. They make pottery that travels like stickers slapped on water bottles. By the Neopalatial period, roughly 1700–1450 bus, Minoan ceramics dominate the Cyclades, and the term Minoanization starts to get tossed around because island sites like Akrotiri on Thera lean heavily into Cretan styles. The town at Akrotiri, buried by the volcanic eruption, later dated by radiocarbon to roughly 1627–1600 B, breathes Minoan aesthetics in Technicolor. Flotilla frescoes with ships, stern to stern, boxing boys with shaved heads and blue scalps, and rosettes that bloom across walls, like a wallpaper catalogue that never ends. The Cyclades become part of a network where Cretan tastes set the tone. Eventually, the network shifts. The big pivot happens in the mid-15th century BICE, when many Cretan palatial sites burn and the mainland moves in. The reasons light up like a debate club. Earthquakes and unrest play a role on a fault-riddled island. Internal political friction does not go away just because the art likes dolphins. Then there is the Thera eruption, a geological beast that dumps ash across the Aegean, spawns tsunamis, and shocks climate and trade. The radiocarbon dates around 1627–1600 BAS, come a little earlier than older archaeological chronologies for the height of Minoan neopalatial life. So the timing gets messy in textbooks. What is not messy is the evidence that in the aftermath, around 1450 Bs, a Mycenaean elite stakes control. Linear B tablets appear at Knossos. Titles like Wolnax and Laurogetus turn up. The style of pottery changes. The Cretan handwriting literally starts spelling Greek. The Mycenaean trick is pure Aegean capitalism. With muscle. They adopt the parts of the Minoan package that make sense for a militarized palatial state and push them hard. Administrative tablets multiply. Fortification walls rise huge and rough, like Cyclops' work. Chariots and armor surge in records, and yet the iconography is still full of griffins and lilies. The religious positions still mention Ares next to Potnia. And the fresco workshop grinds out those bright fields of color, like nothing happened. Cultural continuity with a new client list drives for the next 200 years until the wider Late Bronze Age system buckles around 1200 B. One myth dies hard and deserves to be pinned to the mat gently. The so-called peaceful Minoans. Evans loved the idea because it made his discovery a counterpoint to Mycenaean machismo and modern wars. The lack of monumental fortifications at palaces looked like proof. The frescoes showed dancers and frolicking dolphins rather than phalanxes. It felt like paradise with open courtyards. Then archaeology did what it always does. Added data until the sexy narrative had to move over. Minoan weapons turn up in graves and hoards. Daggers and swords with inlaid gold sparkle in elite kits. Wall paintings at sites like Tel El Dabar in the Nile Delta, executed in an Aegean style, include bull leaping, which starts to feel less like gentle sport and more like an event with injuries as a feature. The harvester vase from Hair Triad shows men singing in procession, while one figure seems to carry a rhyton and another a sistrum, but elsewhere, scenes feature spears and shields, and ivory plaques depict figure of 8 shields that echo warfare. Knossos may have avoided fortification walls, but that can also mean naval dominance served as the wall. Thucydides, in the 5th century BC, calls Minos the first ruler to build a navy and clear the sea of pirates. That statement is a classic Greek habit of projecting institutions back onto myth, but the kernel hits truth. Crete held enough control across shipping lanes that palaces did not need 30-foot walls. Power does not always flex with stone. Sometimes it sails. On the subject of sailing, Minoan influence infiltrates the Greek idea of thalassocracy, the notion of a sea-based empire. The Cyclades during the Neopalatial period present a map of nodes under Cretan sway, not as conquered territory with garrisons on every ridge, but as a cultural, economic web. Castri on Kythera shows Cretan-style architecture and pottery, a Minoan outpost in the literal sense. Finds at Miletus on the Anatolian coast hint at early Minoan-linked presence in Asia Minor before that region grows its own layered identities. When later Greeks imagine rule that sits on ships rather than citadels, when they talk about island chains as extensions of a central power, they are describing something that has a prototype in the Bronze Age Aegean, with Crete at its center of gravity. Mythology picks up those old signals and recasts them. The story of Europa, swept from Phoenicia to Crete on the back of Zeus as a bull, braids Eastern and Cretan strands into a foundation tale that Greeks never stop retelling. Minos judges the dead in Hades in later traditions, which is one way to make a Bronze Age dynasty eternal. Theseus and the Minotaur become an Athenian manifesto about slaying foreign tyranny, complete with a Cretan villain and a thread back from the maze. Underneath the patriotic spin sits a very old memory of a palace complex that felt like a bewildering choreography of rooms, a society that marked itself with bulls and double axes, and rituals that put risk on full display. Minoan religious technology travels too. Peak sanctuaries that dot the Cretan mountains give Greek religion a template for worship linked to landscape. Later Greek cults on mountaintops, like Zeus on Mount Lycaon in Arcadia, or Zeus on Mount Ida in Crete, echo that desire to reach gods where sky meets rock. Cave cults persist. The Dictyon cave and Didyon cave both claim Zeus's birth, a mythic layer on top of very old ritual practice in those spaces. The goddess tradition forks and recombines. Local Cretan figures like Britomartis and Dictina keep their names alive into classical times, sometimes merging with Artemis, sometimes holding their own on coins and in inscriptions. The double axe hangs around in Greek memory and in Carian art across the Aegean, a symbol too iconic to vanish. Language carries another kind of fossil. Greek place names with weird endings, those dash-sos and dash-those clusters, scream pre-Greek substrate to linguists. Knossos, Parnassus, Zakynthos, Corinth, Hyacinthus, and dozens of others share that flavor. The exact pathways are monstrous to trace, because the Aegean had more languages than a modern airport, but the effect matters. Greek is spoken and sung by Homer, sits on an older bedrock of names and terms that likely includes Minoan words. Even labyrinth probably comes from labris. When later Athenians talk about the city Dionysia and show off ancient masks and choruses, when they mention a chorus pattern crafted by Daedalus, they breathe through a line of continuity that passes through Crete and stops briefly in a workshop. 1500 BC, a hard nugget of scientific data locks a baseline into place. In 2017, a large-scale ancient DNA study led by Iosif Lazaridis and others compared genomes from Minoans, Mycenaeans, and earlier Neolithic farmers. The result hit headlines because it cut through ages of speculation. Minoans and Mycenaeans share most of their ancestry, around 3/4 to 4/5, coming from early farmers of the Aegean and Anatolia. Mycenaeans show a bit of extra ancestry from northern or eastern sources, linked to steppe populations. Estimates hover around 4–16%, while Minoans do not. The data do not turn the Minoans into lost Atlanteans, or the Mycenaeans into invaders wiping the slate. It looks like a family with cousins who grew up in slightly different neighborhoods, one of which got some extra influence drifting in from the north. That scientific picture aligns with the archaeological record where Crete shapes the mainland, and then the mainland reshapes Crete, all without a clean break in population. That brings the story back to a shared Bronze Age material culture that is anything but quiet. The bull leap flying over a massive animal's back echoes a society tuned to spectacle, risk, and the management of fear. People wore gold and used storage jars taller than toddlers. Trade routes tied Crete into copper from Cyprus, timber from the Levant, stone from Egypt, and a critically scarce spice called saffron that shows up in paintings as brightly as hair dye. Tin, necessary for bronze, came from somewhere else, a supply chain that scholars track like detectives across Anatolia and beyond. Palatial functionaries counted cattle and chariots and wheels, organized feasts with hundreds of liters of wine, and conscripted labor for textile production at a scale that would make a modern manager break out a spreadsheet. This is not quaint island life. It is industrial art driven by palace demand. Even the controversy that refuses to die, Atlantis, turns into a lens on influence. The Thera eruption deserves its reputation as a massive event. Ash deposits on Crete and tsunami signatures on the north coast show nature flexing hard. The radiocarbon date range, around 1627–1600 B7, does not line up neatly with Plato's story of Atlantis, told in the 4th century B with a timeline of 9,000 years, before Solon and a geography that floats in the Atlantic. The eruption, however, likely destabilized trade and weather patterns across the eastern Mediterranean. That mattered for a network that thrived on exchange and visibility. The palatial system on Crete stuttered, then recovered, then fell under Mycenaean control decades later. Later Greeks still smelled the smoke in the myths, even if they wrapped it in philosophical allegory. The real influence is less about a continent vanishing and more about how a shockwave restructured power, leading to a Greek-speaking elite riding Cretan circuits where Linear B recorded the next chapter. Trade networks also seed influence where myths refuse to reach. An imported Minoan-style rhyton, shaped like a bull's head, is not just a drinking vessel. It is a ritual object that imposes a Cretan aesthetic standard on whatever local rite swallows it. Stone vases carved from hard black serpentine on Crete ended up in mainland contexts, along with all the prestige they carried. Seal stones with spirals, rosettes, and leaping griffins cross thresholds in a pocket of a scribe's tunic, then stamp clay nodules to authenticate shipments from one place to another. The signal says the same thing every time. Cretan style equals authority and taste. When mainland Greece builds out its palaces, they do not simply copy. They hire the brand. The administrative influence runs deeper than mere scripts and tablet habits. The pattern of putting the palace at the center of resource flows, tracking wool from herds to carded thread to woven cloth, controlling bronze stock by weight and profession, and using feasting and performance to cement political ties, is an institutional system that Minoans refine. The mainland runtime reconfigures the palace as a fortress, Yet the logic: mobilize production, redistribute to bind elites, celebrate at scale, reads like code, ported from Crete. At Pylos, the famous saffron tablet series records spices measured out to palace workshops and functions. At Knossos, under Greek scribes, lists of chariot wheels and spearheads appear alongside female workers assigned to textile groups, with quotas that make modern labor historians wince. If later Greek city-states become suspicious of tyrants and centralized power, part of that suspicion looks like a long hangover from Bronze Age kingship. The taste of palace redistribution lingers even as new political forms arise. Daily life details travel too. Olive oil becomes a commodity and ritual medium, used in cooking, lighting, perfuming, and offering. Wine picks up complexity, likely spiced or flavored in the Bronze Age, and stored in amphorae stamped or painted with symbols that function as signatures. Architectural comfort changes how Greeks think a house should breathe. Light wells and air flow in Minoan complexes insert the idea that a building can shape climate, rather than just take punches from it. Lustral basins and monumental staircases set expectations about moving bodies through space for effect. Once people experience that, they do not tend to downgrade. They raise the bar at home. Numbers lock in a sense of scale. Knossos perches about 5 kilometers from the sea, a position that lets a ruler walk down to the harbor at Amnisos in a casual hour. Crete sits roughly 300 kilometers from Athens and about 200 kilometers from the Peloponnese at its closest points across the sea. A day's sail under good wind in the right boat, longer against weather, or while hugging coastlines. That closeness in Bronze Age terms is meaningful. This was not long-distance overland travel, with months of caravan boredom. It was fast if the ship caught the breeze. Minoan ships in the flotilla frescoes at Akrotiri show high prows, multiple oars, decorated sterns, and crew who clearly like to make an entrance. A trader leaves Phaistos with cloth and perfume, and can dock in Kythera, then hop to the Argolid, in less time than it takes modern travelers to get through airport security. The argument about influence even reaches into how later Greeks imagined creativity and technology. Daedalus, the mythic Cretan engineer, becomes the patron saint of cunning craft. That label sits comfortably on a culture that figured out how to dye linen with murex, carve stone vases with walls thin enough to glow, and pour bronze so cleanly that blades and mirrors look like industrial magic. When classical Athenians call high-tech tools daedala, they extend that memory into a vocabulary word, a linguistic monument to Cretan ingenuity. Storytelling refuses to stop there. Greek memories of beehive tombs, called doloi in their own time, function as more than burial spaces. They are architecture as propaganda, projecting stability and lineage deep into the hillside. The mainland version gets enormous, but the original Misera circles on Crete carry social glue for centuries. That kind of memory does not stay trapped on an island. It creeps into the mainland as a building style that can turn ancestors into permanent neighbors. Later Greeks thrive on ancestor talk. They invent genealogies like other cultures invent desserts. This obsession finds a palatial root in Minoan and Mycenaean funerary architecture. Cultural interaction with Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia acts as a force multiplier. Minoans borrowed from the East with gusto, then re-exported a uniquely Cretan package back out. Motifs like papyrus and lotus show up in Cretan frescoes. Egyptian blue pigment turns up in Aegean contexts. Cylinder seals become Aegean sealstones, the shapes and uses morphing along the way. This pattern teaches later Greeks that identity can survive contact and then weaponize it. By the time Ionian Greeks settled along the Anatolian coast, mixing with Lydians and Carians, they are practicing a strategy the Minoans ran centuries earlier. Take external ideas, make them better, sell them back with attitude. The discovery and display of Minoan culture in modern times adds another twist to the influence story. Evans named the culture Minoan after Minos, and then tuned his reconstructions to match the myths. Emile Guillier-Ampère and Fils, the father-son art team working for Evans, filled in gaps on frescoes until missing faces and bodies became complete scenes. The famous Prince of the Lilies, pieced together from fragments, likely combines parts of at least two different figures and a background. The image became a logo anyway. This matters because the early 20th century vision of femininity, color, and elegance painted the Minoans as essentially unlike the Tao, war-obsessed Mycenaeans. The binary stuck, and it still colors pop culture takes. The actual record says the Minoans had sharper edges. Influence grows more believable when the source culture looks complex enough to shape others instead of existing as a utopia miraculously collapsed. Another myth deserves careful deflation with sympathy for its appeal. The idea that the Greeks invented everything out of thin air sits deep in a lot of minds. Homer sings, Athens debates, Plato philosophizes, and the story ends there. The Bronze Age lifts a finger and raises an eyebrow. Greek is one of many Indo-European languages, but its earliest scribal form shows up in a Minoan script. Greek religion is distinctive, but a list of its gods with credible depth sits on clay at Pylos, Knossos, and elsewhere half a millennium before Hesiod. Greek architecture dazzles in marble and proportion, yet comfort with space, light, and decorative color came through palatial experiences on Crete and the mainland before stone drums climbed into place on the Acropolis. This is not a takedown. It is a family tree. The family includes hard labor and human cost. Linear B tablets from Knossos and Pylos list women and girls in work groups for textile production. Some are labeled as slaves, some as free, some with geographic epithets that hint at movement across the Aegean. The palace economy of both Minoans and Mycenaeans runs on hierarchies that can sound ugly to modern ears. Perfumes in tiny alabaster jars smell like thyme and roses, but someone crushed the flowers for hours. Frescoes show athletic grace, but someone mined the pigments and plastered the walls. This is not a story of gentle art floating above politics. It is a story of organized complexity that a later Greek world partly inherits and partly judges. Debates over writing never stop either. The Phaistos disc, discovered in 1908 by Luigi Pernia at Phaistos, stares out of museum cases like a Bronze Age mic drop. Its spiraling stamped symbols, unlike anything else found on Crete. The disc has been called a hoax, a game, a hymn, a legal code, and 100 other things. The scholarly consensus says genuine artifact with unknown meaning. It does not teach Greek to the mainland, nor does it carry influence forward. But the disc's fame shows how the Minoans loom in the Greek imagination as a formative other whose artifacts radiate charisma. Even when Minoans are not directly influencing, they are haunting. Seafaring technology deserves a second look because it quietly shapes Greek possibilities. Aegean ships of the second millennium bus had hulls designed for speed and cargo. They were not mere rafts with delusions of grandeur. The flotilla fresco at Akrotiri shows ships with rigging, multiple oars, capped prows, and deck structures that promise control and precision. When later Greeks field triremes and run naval states, they draw on a long-lived Aegean culture of shipbuilding and seamanship. The exact engineering of a trireme is a leap, But the muscle memory of a sea culture that sees islands as stepping stones rests on a Minoan foundation. The way Greeks imagine kingship and its dangers has a Cretan shadow. Minos comes out in myth as stern, legalistic, close to Zeus, and sometimes monstrous. Greek kings of the archaic and classical periods rule more modestly in most places, and then they tell stories about tyrants who overstep. The haunted corridors of Knossos and the stories of tributes sent from Athens to Crete feed an Athenian self-image built against others. Influence can be productive in opposition. Athens defines itself as the city that outsmarts the labyrinth. That defiance only matters if Crete once mattered. After the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 B, when mainland palaces fall and the Aegean enters a period of reduced complexity, often labeled the Dark Age, Crete does not simply fade. The island keeps producing pottery and maintaining cult sites. Knossos remains occupied. Dorian migration myths later placed tough northern newcomers on Crete, a political narrative tool for city-states. Despite the churn, certain cults persist into the Iron Age. The Idaean cave continues as a sacred center. Aletheia keeps her cult at Amnisos. The thread through time feels thin and pulled, but it does not snap. When Greek city-states bloom in the archaic period, their writers and thinkers look south across the water and mine Crete for stories and models. Spartan lawgivers quote Cretan practices for austere living. Philosophers cite Cretan laws as models or warnings. The island holds up like a mirror for Greek politics and ethics. Visual style lingers too. Greeks, after 700 Bes, dial down fresco and dial up painted pottery. But the training in color and shape that started with Minoan wall painting echoes in the preferences of Greek artists. The love of marine motifs, of rhythmic spirals and running animals, threads through the centuries. It is not a direct line from a dolphin at Knossos to a black figure comassed on an amphora, but the eye that loves pattern and movement, learned in rooms where waves and lilies climb the walls. Influence even sneaks into how Greeks think about knowledge and its guardians. Those palace scribes with their system of signs and sealed rooms become the prototypes of specialists who manage information. When Greeks later develop philosophy and science, they treasure written argument and lists. The alphabet arrives from Phoenician patterns around the 8th century Bes, a huge leap for Greek literary culture. Yet the habit of recording, of knowing that clay or stone can store memory, of treating the written line as a tool for ruling and remembering, already sits in the Aegean mind because of Minoan and Mycenaean clay. Time lends distance. Archaeology adds receipts. Bull leaping bones with trauma. Tsunami deposits on the north coast of Crete, near Palakastro. Radiocarbon calibrations from tree rings narrowed to 1627. 1600 Bes for the Thayer eruption. Limia B tablets baked in the fires of palace destructions. Around 1200 Bes. All these hard points help peel away fantasy. The Minoans did not dissolve into legend without a trace. They vigorously built a world that Greeks remixed. The larger Eastern Mediterranean background helps explain why this influence matters so much. From the 19th century Bas onward, the region looks like a multi-thread braid. Egypt under the Middle Kingdom, then the New Kingdom, receives and sends exotic goods. The Levantine cities manage timber and metals. Anatolia, with Hittites rising in the north and coastal polities in the west, offers a corridor. Minoans in the middle map themselves into this system. Their chief export is not metal alone or any single commodity. It is a taste and a system. When that system hiccups because of geology, climate, and human politics, The ability of Greek speakers to occupy it matters. They do not have to invent the rules. They just have to play. Later, Greek historians and philosophers look back on Crete and curate its memory. Thucydides calls Minos the first to collect tribute by sea and clear pirates, projecting classical concerns into mythic horizons, while preserving an older association between Crete and sea power. Plato uses Atlantis as a moral parable of hubris, not as Bronze Age reportage, yet the imagery he conjures, concentric rings, watery destruction, sits easily next to stories people already told about island disasters. The confidence of Greeks telling these stories says as much about their familiarity with Cretan precedents as it does about their creativity. Culinary rituals carry memory across borders in a way that rarely gets headlines. Minoans press olives, ferment wine, and flavor foods with herbs like thyme and possibly wild saffron. Feasts at palaces use standardized cups and bowls by the hundreds, visible in archaeological layers, as stacks of identical drinking vessels, used once and tossed. A Bronze Age version of single-use glassware. Mycenaeans inherit the same practice and develop it further. The cultural habit of staging a feast with regulated portions, pouring wine in a way people later call krater-based mixing, begins in a world, the Minoan structure. When Greeks sit down in the archaic period and argue about the rules of the symposium, their values about equality of cups, about structured drinking, and about theatrical serving already have training wheels from the palatial past. A final quiet arena of influence sits in the space of ethics and law. Greek city-states in the archaic and classical periods continually compare constitutions. Aristotle collects them. Plato imagines them. Crete shows up as the famous example of a severe, law-bound culture. The reality of archaic Cretan law codes, scratched neatly on stone in Draros and Gortin in the 7th-5th centuries Beth, shows a society obsessed with rules for office holding, marriage, and property. That ferocious legalism develops in its own right. But the comfort with formal regulation and ritualized social control looks like a long, extended inheritance from palatial organization, where every movement of a bushel of grain and a weight of wool lived under oversight. It turns out that cultural memories do not retain details cleanly. They retain patterns. Crete teaches the Greek world that systems work. The Greeks spend centuries picking which systems to love and which to scorn. The story ends up folding back into the clarity of material. Evans concrete still caps Knossos in places, a modern crust over ancient stone. Tourists have strong opinions about it. Some find it gaudy, others grateful, many confused. The palace below remains what it always was, a machine for making social roles visible. That machine worked so well that its influence sailed off Crete across short distances to the mainland, and then across long distances through time. Greeks on the mainland learned how to count and command with Minoan tools, then wrote in their own tongue. They took Cretan gods in syllabic dress and reintroduced them to the world with hexameters and marble. They absorbed the sea culture's certainty that the Aegean is not a barrier, but a highway. They took circular Cretan tomb ideas and built conical stone mountains to house their dead. Myths, in the end, speak the truth slant. When a hero enters a labyrinth and slays a monster, later Greeks say they overcame the fear of a complexity that older Cretans had already mastered. When a craftsman builds wings and flies, later Greeks claim the risk of innovation with words that taste like Crete. When a king judges the dead, later Greeks whisper that the rules run deeper than one city or one time. Bronze Age Crete does not abandon Greece to figure it out alone. It hands the Greeks a toolkit, a blueprint, and a dare. The dare sticks. Shards of Cretan pottery turn up in shaft graves at Mycenae, around 1600 BC, nestled with gold masks and blades. That combination signals elite taste, picking up signals from across the sea. The mainland elites do not collect knickknacks. They collect identity markers. Minoan signet rings with scenes of goddesses and shrines. The Aya Triada sarcophagus, showing rites with lyre players and bulls. And the Palai Castro kuras in hippopotamus ivory and serpentine. A small statue that suggests a local form of divine youth. These items tell Greeks that ritual can be crafted, not just performed. Later, Greek statuary in marble grows bigger, harder, more idealized. But the idea that a god can be present in a portable object starts here. Pieces of the Minoan weight and measure system also hide in Greek practices. Aegean weights show patterns that echo Near Eastern systems, like the Egyptian Deben, while settling into their own standards. Mycenaean administrators clearly understand standardized weight control. When Greek city-states mint coins centuries later, they hammer tiny discs to fixed weight standards. Agenitan, Attic, Corinthian, another echo of respect for measure as power. Crete taught that numbers hold empires together. The Greeks translate that into money. The influence drifts into humor as well, and this is not a throwaway line. Ancient Greek comedy loves Cretans as stereotypes. Clever, crafty, untrustworthy in the sly way that people accuse islanders of playing both sides. The famous paradox of Epimenides, a Cretan who says all Cretans are liars, sits at the intersection of irony and cultural reputation. That kind of meta-joke only works if everyone in the room already knows Crete is a place that shaped Greek tricks and truths. A culture becomes a punchline only after it becomes a baseline. The physical environment of Crete plays its role like a seasoned actor who always hits the light. Mountains slice the island longitudinally. Valleys carry winds and water in patterns that locals memorize and strangers respect or break boats against. The Masara Plain rolls open to the south, like a sheet ready for a harvest. Phaistos and Haya Triada perch to watch it. In the east, Zakros looks out at the sea lanes to Cyprus and the Levant, a forward-operating palace for traders and diplomats. This geography makes the Minoans good at seeing connections, because the island forces them to travel within and then beyond. Later Greeks build on that skill. They turn island life into a skill set, and Crete is the first teacher. Even small categories of material culture echo across centuries with surprising volume. The figure of 8 shield, a Minoan and Mycenaean icon, shows up in later Greek vase painting when artists want to signal old-timey heroes, a visual shorthand for the Bronze Age. Homer's epithets about well-greaved Achaeans and bronze-clad warriors nod to a metal-saturated world. The love of pebbled floors, decorative inset, and careful drywall illusions in Minoan palaces screws into Greek architecture in subtle ways. White plaster that imitates stone at Knossos later turns into a full-blown Greek obsession with real marble and its optical perfection. Everything folds into a final summary that would have made minimal sense to Evans, because it has less romance and more gears, yet would have made absolute sense to a scribe at Knossos. Minoan civilization influenced Greece by giving it tools, a writing tradition that Greek could step into, a visual language that mainland elites adopted and adapted, a religious palette with goddesses and rites that fit new names, a palace economy that modeled centralized redistribution, a maritime posture that taught Greeks to see the Aegean as a map of opportunities, and an architectural ambition that made scale part of politics. The influence does not present as a single transmission in a single decade. It unfurls as contacts over 500 years, as a palimpsest of practices passed and repurposed. They left something else as well, something less tangible and more stubborn. They left a mood. Later Greek poetry and prose carry a tone when they talk about Crete, a mix of wonder, suspicion, and a sense that Crete always played the game slightly differently. The Greeks took that and made it their own. They turned Cretan difference into a resource, mined it for myths and models, and then used those to build theatres, constitutions, and fleets. Meanwhile, under the concrete and the debate, the ruins on the island hold their ancient cool. The light wells still catch sun. The magazines still smell faintly of earth and archaeology. The double axe carved on a block still looks like power. And somewhere out in the Aegean breeze is the sound of a ship taking a wave perfectly. A trick learned thousands of years ago and still paying off. Crete taught Greece to chase that sound and to build a civilization that could follow it past the horizon, with a ledger in one hand and a story in the other.